Chapter 1. The wondrous blue sky hangs over one of the lush forests of Sanctum, radiating light through the trees and creating the few shadows there always are in this sunless land. Though no sun dances in the sky, light is abundant from the heavens. Though no wind ever blows or weather changes, the land remains in its ever-peaceful state, like it has all been frozen in time. Zev walks behind his older brother Simon through the greenery that sits still against the ground and hangs pleasantly above, only a single branch swaying as a small rodent-like creature stands on it. Simon takes in a deep breath as his eyes scan around them, searching for a nice, clear area to train in. Energy lightly glows a pale red in the whites of his eyes as he feels around them with his senses, making sure no one else other than the birds will bother them. Zev walks closely behind, looking from side to side and taking in the beauty of their local forest as usual on training days like today, though before he knows it, his face bumps right into his brother's back. Simon stands tall and unmoving, his head turning back to smile at his little brother as he speaks with a cheerful tone. I think this is as good a place as any to start our training for today, Zev. Really? We can finally get started. Zev barks out like a dog finally getting its treat. He is a fit 16-year-old boy with medium-length, slicked-back black hair and deep emerald eyes that can almost always get him out of trouble. Those eyes are now staring up at Simon with enough excitement to make him let out a soft laugh. Did you bring your Sethra enhancing glove? I really think we can find your type today. Simon looks down at his younger brother with hope. He stands just a bit taller and quite a bit more broad than Zev, just a few years older, but in terms of skill at controlling Sethra, the energy that flows through all living things, they might as well be decades apart. Even so, Zev pulls the glove from his backpack with a look of determination in his eyes. Even if his brother is a prodigy and he is... whatever the opposite of that is, it isn't going to stop him from giving it his all every day. And your Soul Kindler's manual? Simon continues going down a mental checklist with him. When have I ever not, Simon? Can we skip this part? I really have a good feeling about today. Simon shakes his head with a bit of a giddy smirk. Honestly, me too, little brother. You're going to show them all what you can do soon, he says as he looks back towards town, his smirk fading a bit. I can feel it. Zev puts his maroon glove on and clenches his fist a few times, looking at it closely. Even if I only have a little Sethra, he clenches his fist and keeps it that way firmly. As long as it's a good type. It will be, Zev. Now let's sit and meditate for a bit. I want you to look inward and place your hand out just like last time. Try to feel the Sethra inside yourself. Right, got it. He nods his head and quickly sits down, crossing his legs and holding his maroon-gloved hand forward, his palm facing the sky. They have done this dozens of times this year alone. Zev would close his eyes, trying to focus on the Sethra inside himself and try to push it into the glove to get a response from it. Children years younger than him use these gloves and find out their type of Sethra every day. If only his would just work. What was he doing wrong? Was he not feeling hard enough? All he did was feel this was ridiculous. Focus, Zev. Stop thinking so much, I can see it on your face. Simon chimes in, not getting a response from Zev, just a long, drawn-out sigh of frustration. Breathe, Zev, he adds quickly, like Zev would suffocate without him. You always make it look and sound so easy. Zev stops thinking so much and remembers the way his brother described it. Make your mind absolutely blank until all you can see is darkness. Then you need to see yourself without seeing yourself. What did that even mean? Focus, darkness, nothing but him. His thoughts fade away piece by piece, leaving nothing but a blank space for him to stare at in his own head. A warmth in his stomach grows slightly. He has felt this many times before. But what should he do with it? It is so faint. He pushes the sensation up toward his chest, then his head. A buzzing he can now feel behind his eyes is making it hard to focus, but he endured. The void stays dark and filled with nothing in his mind. Will he really stay on the same level as children his whole life? He cannot allow that to happen. He has to see something, anything. Today, in this moment, will be the first time he does. A purple version of his face fades into his void staring back at him. Its eyes are hollow, and its lack of expression sends a shiver through Zev's entire body. His eyes snap open. He shouts, "Not that! I did not want to see that!" Even though the image has frightened Zev and made him a bit pale. When he looks across to Simon's wide-eyed expression of glee, Zev is almost too scared to look down at his maroon glove. When he finally looks down, he sees a few inches of twirling purple string like Sethra in his palm, dancing between his fingers slowly. "You actually did it," Simon chokes out through a smile, trying to hide the tears forming in his eyes. "I did." Zev is paralyzed for a moment before jumping to his feet and shouting, "I did it!" Simon wipes his eyes and quickly stands up, pulling out a large tome from his backpack and flipping through page after page. "I've never felt one like this before. Such an interesting color," he says, flipping one more page and widening his eyes. "Is this it?" What is it, Simon? Don't leave me guessing." His smile stretches ear to ear. He has finally broken through to Ember, the lowest soul kindler stage. "String Sethra?" Simon sounds as confused as Zev looks. "String?" The word stutters out of Zev in his confusion as he looks back to the purple energy string bouncing playfully between his fingers as if mocking him. How strong could a little string be? He was hoping for a type like Simon's Shadow Sethra. Seeing the look growing on Zev's face, Simon quickly shuts the tome and puts it away before going over to his brother and grabbing his shoulders. "Zev, hey listen, String Sethra is..." He pauses and arranges the words in his head. "It's just not very researched or common. You can be the one to define it." Hearing Simon's confidence slowly come back to his words grips Zev's heart and brings him out of his thoughts again. As the two begin to talk it over and build goals and strategies for training his new power, the birds around them suddenly scatter from all the trees. The air around them starts to feel heavy, as if the world were trying to drag them to kneel. Simon stands through the pressure with shock in his expression. Zev, on the other hand, falls to one knee almost instantly, with a jolt of pain as he hits the dirt. Panic bubbles up from Zev's throat as he grunts out through forced grit teeth. "Simon, what the hell is this feeling?" He isn't able to hear Simon as a red flash of lightning strikes the ground 20 feet in front of them. The sound is like a point-blank boom of thunder, followed by a crackling fire as a red circle of Sethra forms where the strike landed and begins to glow so brightly that it is hard to look at. His ears are ringing loudly now as he sees a creature emerging from the fiery red Sethra. It is slightly larger than a normal wolf but shares a similar body. Its eyes are pure red with no white sitting on its grey face, with the fur of its cheeks slowly morphing back into draconic scales that cover every part of the beast. A flaming, horse-like mane of Sethra springs from its head and down its back, leading to its wild tail that shares the same appearance. The pressure eases slightly in the air, but the fear of the situation sets in twice as fast when the beast sets its gaze on the brothers with a snarl that Zev can only see as his ears aren't quite working yet. Simon's hand flings out in front of his younger brother, shouting something to him that sounds like muffled nonsense. The draconic wolf beast leaps at them powerfully, with legs enhanced by fire Sethra, leaving even more scorch marks in the grass than the red ring it came from. Simon throws his hand back towards Zev. Shadow Sethra, as black as closed eyes, explodes from his palm in a wave that hits the ground and swims across it as easily as a fish in water. Zev panics, trying to stand up fully until the shadow mass stretching from his brother's palm goes under his feet, knocking him forward onto a wave of shadow that is quickly flying away from the battle. Zev looks up to see one of Simon's arms toward him, guiding the shadow wave he was riding, and the other in front of him, blocking, the Sethra beast's fiery fangs sinking into his forearm. The whole scene gets swallowed up by the trees as the shadow energy carries Zev forcefully away. He can't believe the speed of his brother Sethra. The shadow beneath him begins to quickly fade, only losing a little speed, definitely not enough to make for a good stop. The Sethra breaks apart and fades into nothing, leaving Zev gliding a few inches above the ground before hitting it and spinning into a harsh roll, tucking himself into a ball as best he can until his back slams against a tree trunk and all the breath leaves his body at once. Zev shakily gets to his feet, trying to catch his breath as his legs wobble. At least he can hear again, finally. Zev begins swiftly processing what has just happened, his legs moving him forward before his brain is even done, running as fast as he can back toward where he can now hear the devilish snarling distantly. He couldn't have gotten hurled that far away, could he? Simon could handle this, couldn't he? But if he could, why would he have pushed him away? He has to make it back. He has to help. He runs directly into a tree branch, stumbling forward and continuing to run as his panicked mind races to find some way he could be useful. Closer now, he hears Simon yelling something out, "Shadow Serpent's Blade." Zev feels his heart sink into his stomach. That is his brother's signature ability, and he speaks its true name, meaning he is serious. The younger brother rushes forward, past a few familiar trees, and back into the clearing. Simon stands in view, his right arm hanging limp and scorched to his side as his left holds the prod of his ability. A solid black sword with a segmented structure that lets it function as a 10-foot whip of Shadow Sethra. The refinement of the Sethra is strong enough to make the weapon completely physical. The scaled wolf is still on the attack, using its bursts of fire to leap at Simon. Even with a limp, broken and burned arm, his older brother dodges each attack by swinging between trees with his whip-like blade. As the wolf vaults again at Simon, leave trail of fire, he swings around a high tree branch, launching himself far into the sky, looking down at the beast, and letting out a loud yell as he swings his whip blade down. The segments of sharp Sethra wrapping around the wolf's neck. Simon lands heavily on the beast's back and makes his blade tighten around it like a dangerous leash with his control over the weapon. The wolf's scales crack and the blades sink in, causing the beast to growl and ooze blood from its neck. But it isn't enough to finish it. Its eyes quickly look around as it shakes its body, trying to get Simon off of it. Its eyes lock right onto Zev, who's standing just 15 feet away, wide-eyed, trying to think. Zev feels and sees the fire Sethra gathering in the back of the beast's throat as it opens its mouth. Sethra spinning in place, charging up into a ball of energy radiating red and orange light. His very soul quivers as he feels the level of difference between him and the creature. It isn't an ember-level soul, not even a flame-level soul, but an inferno-level soul, just like Simon. His eyes rise to see Simon on the creature's back, looking like he is trying to strangle it with his whip-like sword, and their eyes meet. Simon looks terrified, and his normally calm voice comes out strained. "Zev, run away!" Run away? The heat around the beast's maw is readily aimed at Zev, an ember outrunning the attack of an inferno. The impossible request could never be met. Zev stares blankly into the largest ball of fire he has ever seen, frozen in place, as the beast launches the ball into a blazing stream of flame from between its jaws. Chapter 2. Zev! Simon cried out as he yanked as hard as he could on his weapon with his good arm, causing the beast's head to jerk a few feet to the side. The beam-like stream of fury ripped through tree after tree like they were made of paper. Simon didn't have enough strength to hang on much longer with only one working arm. He knew that as soon as the beast stopped its attack, it would finish shaking him off of it. He was the strongest of his age in many years. If he couldn't show it with physical strength, he would show it in his technique. Speaking the true name of an ability made it much stronger, especially when speaking that name with a goal in mind. Spiral Constriction. The hilt of his blade dispersed into shadow particles in his hand as the serpent-like blade looked as if it had gained a life of its own, twirling around the beast's neck in an instant and tightening further in. The beast barked a hellish sound more akin to a dragon's roar, blood leaking from its wounded throat as the last of its fire stream faded away. Simon points his hand at the blade serpent around the draconic wolf's neck and clenches his fist, using spiral constriction to its fullest. The black serpent blade began to twist and close tighter and tighter around the beast as Simon let out a pained yell, focusing every bit of Sethra he had into this one attack. The blade spun faster and faster around the monster's throat, Sethra whirring as it finally broke fully through the scales, then sliced all the way through the beast. With a loud thud, the beast's head hit the forest floor and its body slumped to the side with Simon, who landed on his back, panting heavily from how much Sethra he had expended all at once. Zev stood paralyzed with fear. 2 treetops crashed around him, narrowly missing him as they fell. He stared at the dead Sethra beast lying next to his exhausted older brother. Was it over? Simon looks up, slowly catching Zev's eyes. He is safe. Simon gives a wide smile to his little brother. The dead body of the creature began to glow with fire. Sethra and Simon paled. He knew this could only mean one thing. Someone had placed a dormant ability on this creature that would only activate upon killing it. Simon stood quickly, immediately understanding the gravity of the situation with his sharp mind, and turned to Zev, his one good arm outstretched. "Zev, I promise I'll come back." And with one shaky step forward, the beast-turned bomb would explode into a roaring pillar of fire, Sethra stopping just a few feet in front of the younger brother. Zev's eyes feel like they might melt from his sockets as they shake in confusion. "Come back," he mutters into the pillar of fire that slowly burned away into the sky, leaving nothing but scorched earth ash. And what Zev had only heard of, a soul link. Simon's soul link. It hung in the air. Shadowy Sethra had created a black object resembling a decorated padlock. The dark padlock depicted a sun shining rays through a forest surrounding the would-be keyhole. Zev stood inches from it, now examining it, as the Sethra began to shiver in place and become unstable. He knew this from his studies. When someone passed away, their soul link would crumble from the layer they were born in, and they would be reborn 3 layers below. The padlock began to crack and shake faster, the black Sethra dissolving down toward the ash and dirt. Zev tries to grasp Simon's link, but it glides through his fingers as easily as water from a pump. 3 layers below? That would be layer 4. With his mind slowly beginning to race and panic setting back in, Zev wondered how he would ever see his brother again. His school studies playing back in his head as time felt like it was standing still. The world Sanctum belongs to is made up of 12 layered realities, with Sanctum being the first layer at the top and the safest. Each layer is contained in its own plane of existence, and traveling between layers is harder the further your soul link is from your body, the link of course being tied to the layer you were born or reborn into. As far as Zev knew, only the first 3 layers were inhabited by enough people to form towns. Simon would be all the way down on layer 4, reborn into a body that reflected the traits of the layer. Would he be fighting for survival? Or maybe the books in Sanctum were wrong, and there were friendly people that far down. Zev takes a deep breath, watching the rest of Simon's soul link seep through the dirt and disappear on his knees. A few weeks had passed since the Sethra beast had ripped its way into Sanctum to steal Simon from Zev and his mother, Ruth. He had never seen his mother so devastated as she had been on the day of Simon's farewell. The town gathered in a festival of sorts to celebrate the life his older brother had lived on their layer. It was the biggest farewell Zev had ever seen for someone, probably due to Simon being the most prestigious soul kindler of his age, second to none. Even King Orin gave a speech, praising Simon and showing his hurt over the great loss. But it all felt like a blur to Zev, passing by so quickly that it was as if the whole ordeal had been a dream, and now his brother was just gone. He barely even cared about his own achievements anymore. He wielded a rare and useless Strung-type Sethra. His mother told him he could train up and become a flame, then use his Sethra type to aid in projects around town. But that felt so far from where he wanted to be. A few weeks quickly turned to months as life sped past Zev with a great sense of hopelessness. Even in this state, he did what he had always done, trained his body and mind in his town's training grounds and library. It was just afternoon when Zev had finished his morning run and meditation, and was now sitting to do research with the few new books he had borrowed. He sat at the back of the library at the table he always chose, reading a book titled Ember to Flame, A Youngster's Guide. It was embarrassing to always read these books clearly designed for kids years younger than him, but he needed to rehearse the information in his head now that he had actually become an ember. Zev knew the most basic description for soul kindlers. There were 5 stages. Coals were lacking in Sethra entirely, as he had been. Embers, as he was now, had just unlocked their Sethra and type. Flames could control their Sethra much more precisely, even using simple abilities. Infernos, like Simon, could start to craft and use unique techniques with power stretching to their body's own limits. Then there was the final stage, Novas. Honestly, not much about them was known. The only Nova living in Sanctum was King Orin, and he never spoke about how he ascended. Zev rubs his face as the information sits on his head like an idiotic crown while he thinks, I know all this already. And I know that to progress my power, I need to understand it. But how am I supposed to do that when it's so rare? Zev laid face first in the book, sighing when he felt a thud on the table next to him, his face turning to look up at a very peculiar young lady around his age. Green, medium-length hair like an unkempt bush sat around her head, big circular glasses hanging over her small diamond-like white eyes, and freckles dotted around her nose and cheeks. The huge satchel she had placed next to him, and was now digging through, was a dull brown color, and every nook seemed to be filled with junk. She was dressed in common clothes of yellow and blue. Her strange eyes slowly moved over to look at his gaze, and a toothy smile creeped on her face as she realized he had been sitting here. Sorry, she peeped out, scooting over and tugging her satchel further from him. Zev looked over at the strange girl and got a bit lost looking into her white eyes. He knew sometimes ascending could change physical features, but becoming an ember had done nothing for him. She purses her lips a bit nervously, looking from side to side at other full tables before saying, Is it okay if I sit here? Yeah, of course, sorry. I wasn't trying to stare, he almost shouts before quickly lowering his voice. Your eyes are just very interesting. Is that from Ascension? She takes a step back, just to lean down, and show off her eyes with pride. Oh, these little peepers. You better believe it, these are the eyes of a flame ready to become an inferno. She sounded a mixture of boastful and awkward. Zev's eyes light up as he almost stammers over his words. Seriously? At your age? That's incredible. That would make you almost on par with Simon's name catches in his throat as his expression drops a bit. The one they called Simon here? Yes, it would. The name's Mira. What's yours? She stretches a hand to him in a friendly way, a grin stretching around her face confidently. Chapter 3. Mira was sitting on a stump in the forest next to her oversized satchel, thumbing through a big book as she scribbled around the pages. Her gaze kept occasionally glancing up at Zev as he sat on his knees in the grass, meditating in silence. She couldn't believe he was Simon's brother. She had stuck around with him to listen to his story, but he was so underwhelming. Everything she had heard about Simon was amazing. Zev was, he was ambitious, that was for sure. Zev opens one eye, looking at her in his meditation position. Can I help you? Maybe, she says, blankly lost in her own thoughts, staring over at him. Zev takes a deep breath, closing his eye and gathering his thoughts before shooting back. Well, I've told you the story too many times already. You know it as well as I do by now. It's been days if you... Mira cuts him off and bluntly says, Are you planning on going down to find him? Or are you going to sit up here and wait for Simon to come back? Zev freezes at her words, completely caught off guard. A whole array of thoughts floods through his mind. Sure, he had thought about traveling down to find Simon, but how could he, as an ember? He would need to be at least a flame before he could go to layer 2. Mira snaps her fingers in front of his face and says, Zev, are you listening? He shakes his head quickly and stands up to meet her gaze. Yes, sorry, I guess I just don't know how I'd do that. I'm just not strong enough as an ember. His big emerald eyes look to be begging for an answer that he didn't believe existed. Mira's smile grows wide. Then, why don't we figure out how to get you to flame? I've done tons of meditation studies. Way more than you have. She opens her arms out as if mimicking the tree branches around them. Zev is a bit stunned at her enthusiasm, which kind of reminds him of the endless well of positivity that Simon has always had. His heart quickens its beating pace as he scratches the side of his head. Why do you want to help me? Mira puts her arms down, and her wide smile softens. Because I want to go down the layers and I don't want to go alone. There's so many other better soul kindlers you could go with. Why? Mira cuts him off again, putting a hand up. My dad always said, find the people with a goal in their hearts. I'm no expert on people, but you seem like the kind of person my dad would like. Even with everything happening around you, you haven't stopped once. Even though you didn't realize you were working toward finding Simon, you have been. Zev felt his chest clench up and his breath shake. Is that really why you've been hanging around me these last few days? You were watching me to see if I'd be a good partner to travel down with? Well, that, and the fact that the story's really interesting, truly, knowledge is what I'm after. My parents own a library, kind of like the one in your town. I've always felt like the books and information we have about the lower layers is... She pauses and shakes her head before continuing. Lacking to say the least. Zev can't help but smile. No one but Simon has ever shown so much faith in him, not even his own mother. She was kind and loved him, of course, but her thoughts on him were always so realistic and detached from what he wanted to be. He looks at Mira with cautious excitement. You really think I can reach flame fast enough to not hold you back? Mira sits back on the old log with a thud, pulling her oversized book of notes into her lap and laughing. Hold me back? I mean, what's a few months of training? I'm going to have a fierce teammate after all this. A few months? It had taken Zev so many years just to reach Ember. How would he ever? Thoughts of Simon wash over him. He would believe in him. Even Mira looked at Zev like this was no sweat at all. He had to prove them right. But more than anything, he needed to finally prove to himself that he wasn't the one to hold anyone back anymore. Zev clenches both fists, looking down at them. Shock grips him as the grass beneath his feet seems to get erased by a wide, spreading darkness. His eyes shoot up to see Mira's cocky smile as she forms a pitch-black Sethra bubble around them, the only visible things in the field being her, the stump she sat on, and Zev. She shuts her oversized book, setting it beside her on the large stump, before locking eyes with him. Training and meditation are my specialty. This is a product of my knowledge, Sethra. I hope you like it. Zev looks around the blackness of the void with wonder. This ability is amazing, and you didn't even speak its true name. This seems like an Inferno-level technique. seems like is correct. Knowledge Sethra attacks the physical senses of a person. This isn't real, it's just what I'm making you see. An amazing tool for learning and training, I assure you. Mira gets into a meditation pose, pushing up her circular glasses, crossing her legs, and holding her hands together over her navel. Now, why don't we start with a new meditation pose? It's possible the one Simon taught you just isn't right for you. It's a very personal thing. Zev scrambles to sit across from her, a few feet from the stump, and emulates the pose she struck. Like this? Am I doing it right? He chirped with jittery excitement, causing Mira to let out a soft laugh and give him a few pointers. They spent the rest of the day practicing a few different meditation poses, and the rest of the week dedicating a few whole days to each one. Zev finds the one he resonates the most with, which is called the ebbing tide. It's a standing pose that starts with both hands pressed together, fingertips to the opposite wrists. He would hold his arms and hands in front of his chest, taking deep breaths and focusing on nothing except the flow of Sethra through his whole body. Eventually, even when his muscles would tire, the Sethra would keep him and his arms up as his breath pushed it through his limbs. This meditation pose was utterly exhausting and took everything out of him after just 30 minutes, but the effects on increasing his Sethra were almost immediate to see. In only 2 weeks, Zev's Sethra strengthened to 3 times what it had been before. Nowhere near Mira's level, or any flames for that matter, but it was more progress than he had made in his entire life, and he could feel a newfound pride surging through him with each passing day. While the first few days had been Zev telling Mira his story over and over again, the next 2 weeks it was becoming increasingly hard to ignore her gushing passionately about all the books she would write and all the knowledge she would share with Sanctum when she returned from traversing the deeper layers. Zev found himself enjoying her strange rambling, usually unless she was actively distracting him from meditating or trying to manifest his Sethra. The biggest help besides the new meditation pose was all the visual aids Mira could provide him with her knowledge Sethra. She had read and understood so many flame-level training methods and simple techniques that often Zev felt like she was a walking library. Except even better, he could physically see what she knew. Mira had even started staying with him and his mother, Ruth, helping out around the house and doing odd jobs with them to make a bit of coin when not training. Ruth wasn't fully on board with the idea of them training to go down to Layer 2, but the help was very appreciated now that Simon was gone, so she didn't fight them too hard on training every single day. Honestly, she was proud of how far Zev had already come. Maybe he really would be able to reach Flame. It would probably take quite a few years, but she was much more confident than she had been. People in town were a bit more harsh with how they saw things. Mira was clearly a crazy student wasting her potential, and Zev was a lost cause. A late-to-the-party Ember who would never make it far enough to be helpful to anyone. None of that bothered them as they continued the cycle of helping Ruth and training day after day. It almost felt like another blink through time for Zev as 2 more months passed by. Though this time was different, he wasn't just mindlessly training himself to get through each blurry day. The world was brighter, more crisp, and full of life. He was training with a solid goal now, and the best partner he could ask for had dropped right into his lap. He felt just as blessed as having been born Simon's brother. Zev was meditating in his favorite part of the forest near town when he heard Mira coming up from his left side and saying, "All right, that's time. 2 whole hours and you're barely breaking a sweat." I got to say, I'm impressed. Zev drops his ebbing tide pose, panting and feeling like he had done nothing more than a light run. The first week, he thought his heart would fly out of his chest after 30 minutes. The Sethra flowing through his body felt so sturdy compared to then, a confident smile sliding across his face to greet Mira. "It's barely even difficult anymore. I feel like I could go another hour, no problem." Mira cracks a smirk to meet his energy and rests her hand against the large tree to her right. "Is that so? Then how about we start getting serious? Think you can manifest a simple ability?" Zev's eyebrows almost leap off his head as he stammers over his words. "An ability? But I would need to be a flame to do something at that level." He holds his hands up as if to slow down her thought process with sheer will. Mira shakes her head, pushing up those big circular glasses as usual while she speaks. "You would have to be a flame, true? So are you one yet? There is only one way for us to find out, really." She takes her hand off the tree and pulls out her big book, flipping the pages to find a simple technique that would fit his Sethra type. Zev takes a deep, shaky breath as his thoughts on it gather. Clearly, he wasn't a flame yet. Usually someone would feel a change in their Sethra level, but was he actually ready to take that step and push for flame? If he wasn't fully ready, he could harm himself, and who knows how long it would take to recover. Mira was pushing him forward so fast he needed time. Thoughts of Simon's soul link disappearing into the ashen dirt fill his mind. He didn't need time. He needed to be a flame. He closes his eyes and steadies his breath. Let's do it. I can handle this, no problem. His smile springs right back onto his face as his eyes lock on Mira. Chapter 4. The stone brick that made up King Oren's castle loomed over Zev like the blade of a guillotine, his heart beating against his chest until it felt it might escape. King Oren wanted to see him and Mira personally, with very little explanation to them, just a simple flame messenger that morning. Oren was a quiet man who never seemed to do much, at least openly, but he was also the only Nova in all of Sanctum. Zev knew that the king's power was beyond anything he could even dream of, so why did he want to see him? Mira took a step forward, looking back as she adjusted the satchel at her side. Are you coming, Zev? You look paralyzed. Yeah, of course. Sorry, I've just never been inside the castle before. It's incredible to look at. He tries to shoo away his nerves before continuing to walk through the large open doors of the castle, following closely behind Mira, who looks forward and comments. At least you live in the same town as the king. I'm not even from around here. Her small laugh lightens his mood. The two anxious new friends are greeted by stale air as they enter the castle. Zev had heard rumors that King Oren didn't have any attendants or guards around him unless in public, but this place looked more like an abandoned tomb than a king's home. The sound of a creaking wooden door, followed by the clink of a black metal boot, washed through the room like thunder. Zev almost jumped as he saw the king make his way to meet them in the center of the room, his presence intimidating. Oren's spiky and unkempt hair hung all the way down to his lower back, and his armor was made of a dark, almost black metal with pale, golden trim that had clearly faded from time. The king loomed over the children with his large bear-like build, and his half-closed dark grey eyes somehow looked both lazy and fierce as they rested on the two of them. Zev, good to see you again, and Mira, it's a pleasure to meet you. The gruff voice and tired tone didn't feel like they matched the words coming from the king. Zev vaguely remembered the king greeting him and his mother, and wishing them well at Simon's farewell, but most of that time was still a foggy blur to him. Zev simply smiles and gives the king a polite bow. Thank you for your kind words. Me and my mother were touched. He couldn't even really remember, but it felt like the right thing to say. Mira glances at Zev before dipping into a quick bow herself. Honored to meet you, King Oren. She hurried out. Up. Oren called out a command, turning and walking toward a far back door toward the middle of the room. 2 windows on either side of it showing the room was rich with light and greenery. Follow me to my garden. I'd like to discuss a rumor I've been hearing about you two. His voice was still dripping with exhaustion, like a wet rag getting dragged across the stone. Zev stood straight at the same time as Mira, their eyes meeting for a moment. He could see her nerves shining through her confident smile, so he gave her a wider grin and nodded. That's what Simon would have done for him. Mira relaxes a bit and keeps moving forward after Oren with him. The center of the castle was a beautiful circular garden. The floor was entirely grass, and the ceiling was completely open to the light from the bright sunless sky. King Oren stood in the center of his garden, resting his back against a large apple tree that rose in the middle of everything. Looking back at the young soul kindlers, his eyes grew heavier, and he spoke firmly. You two seek to traverse down into Layer 2? His eyes went to Zev, feeling pointed. It felt more like he was asking Zev directly. Mira notices the gaze point at Zev and tries to speak, but stops as Oren holds a large, scarred hand up. You think an ember can even traverse down a layer from their soul link? Zev, I understand you lost your... Zev couldn't believe it, even as he did it, but his words cut through the king's. I'm not an ember, sir. Oren looked stunned for a moment, then amused, raising a disbelieving eyebrow. Oh, really? An ember with enough confidence to interrupt me? Care to prove it, young man? The king sounded like he might laugh. Zev took a deep breath, focusing his Sethra through his right arm, gathering it in his hand and pointing it up at an apple on the tree. His voice came out calm and commanding as he spoke. Grapple. 5 thin purple strings of Sethra shoot out of Zev's fingertips quickly and wrap around the apple tightly. Oren's eyes widen ever so slightly and a smile creaks slowly up the side of one cheek. Zev tugs his arm back, retracting his strings, and in an instant he is holding the apple his ability had plucked from the tree. Well, well, you really are a flame, and so quickly at that. The king crossed his arms, looking back at Mira. I suspected you were a good teacher, but this is impressive, young lady. I'm glad I caught you before you both slipped away. Mira's diamond-like white eyes widened in surprise, first because she didn't expect to get recognition for Zev's ascension, and second because Oren seemed to know that they had been planning on traversing to Layer 2 very soon, today to be exact. Her words came quickly, almost defensively. Well, yes, I would say my talent for training is very impressive. She pushes her glasses up on her nose. Everything came together so smoothly. I was planning on traversing within the next few days. Zev occupies his mouth with the crunch of the royal apple as the king stands and paces around Mira, eyeing her closely. He was sensing the Sethra inside of her and gathering data. The smirk on his face morphed into a full smile and soft chuckle as he stopped in front of her. Kids are crazy these days, you know that? You're already almost an inferno. I suppose I can allow you two to go down, but you both need to understand that even just one layer down is a huge difference. His more cheerful tone carried the light scolding of a parent. Mira looks up at the giant man with a determined nod, before her eyes shift back to Zev, who has finished his bite of the fruit. Mira gathers up all of her pride and confidence before locking her eyes back on Oren. I know it'll be a leap, but I know as long as we stay together, we'll be all right. I bet we'll be able to train even harder on Layer 2. Her excitement bubbles. Zev smiles broadly. Hearing her talk about it reminded him of all their conversations about it the last few months. He couldn't stop his own excitement from joining hers. Exactly. Everything we do know says that Layer 2 has soul kindlers way more dedicated to the arts. Maybe we can find new methods to learn. King Oren nods his head along with their passionate words before putting one heavy hand on each of their shoulders. I'll be honest with you two, Layer 2, Nocturne, it's a wondrous place, and many kindlers seek guidance among its beauty. The dangers will be plenty, and safety is never a guarantee with traversal. It's harsh and chaotic by nature. He squeezes their shoulders tighter. You can stay here, train under me in the safety of Sanctum until you're better fit. Zev looks at the bitten apple in his hand, squeezing it while lost in his thoughts until juice runs down one side of the mark. What an amazing opportunity. He never dreamed of getting an offer like this from a Nova. Mira must be just as stunned as him, but holding off on traversing down to Nocturne even longer. When he knew Simon was even lower in the layers than that, it made Zev's stomach twist in knots. Even if it was foolish, he knew what he wanted. His eyes shift to Mira, who was resting hers on him already. With unspoken understanding, she gives him a soft smirk and nods. Zev brings his eyes back up to the towering king, and for the first time, he feels like he has the ability to make his own decision, with his own strength. We're going to Layer 2. Nocturne is the first real step in this journey. If I can't take it, will I ever see my brother again? His eyes steadied with resolve, even in the intimidating presence of the Nova-level king. Oren gave Zev an understanding and somber look. Very well, I understand. He takes a step back and places out his open palms to them. Both of you, give me your wrists. With a bit of confusion, they both placed their right wrists in his hand, letting him grip them. The king took a breath and spoke. Brand! Oren's Sethra sizzled against their skin and popped like bacon in a pan. It slightly stings, and smoke rises from between his fingers as his grip loosens. Soon enough, Zev and Mira were staring at the underside of their wrists, and a dark symbol that looked like a drawn-on eye sat on each of them. This was a common ability with the power of a Nova. Behind it, the purpose was to send an alert to the user if the branded person was harmed. Zev, feeling his nerves stir again, says, "What is this for?" Oren crosses his arms, leaning back against his apple tree as he slumps back into his lazy posture and tired voice. "It's for when you get hurt, for when I have to prepare both of your farewells." His eyes shift between them slowly. "But let's hope I'm never given such an alert. Got it?" Mira stands straight and firm next to Zev, who matches her energy, looking at the king as they speak in unison. "Got it." The surprisingly kind, perhaps a bit off-putting King of Sanctum guides the young, ambitious soul kindlers through his garden and back into the castle, this time toward the back of the large royal structure. They enter a room filled with shadows, lit only by candles in stands, surrounding some kind of circle on the floor drawn in a dark chalk-like substance resembling charcoal. A traversal ring. Zev was sure. They were used to help make traversal between the layers possible. It looked identical to the one Mira had shown him in her books, the one they planned on creating in the nearby forest. Oren turns to them and gestures to the ring on the floor. It'll be safer if I help. Whenever you two are ready, just step into the ring. With a fire burning inside both of them, a few deep breaths, and some glances between each other, Mira and Zev walk forward and stand in the center of the ring. Oren walks to the front of the circle, placing his hands on the ground and running his Sethra through it slowly. Seek guidance as soon as you can from anyone who will help. Well, except maybe Levon, anyone but him. His tone petered out into an annoyed grimace as he continued. Just don't linger in places that feel unfamiliar. Stay safe. Zev and Mira give the king a confused but excited nod as the ring begins to light up with a cylindrical wall of white Sethra from the floor to the ceiling. Zev calls out through the flowing power in the room. When we come back, I'll have Simon with me. Mira tacks on. And my writings too. I'll give Sanctum more information than it can even handle. The white glowing energy grows stronger along with the rushing sound it's producing, all senses getting blinded by a flash of light and sound. Chapter 5. Yekuthiel was only 13 years old when it was discovered he was still a Cole. In Layer 3, the feral wilds, this was punishable by banishment into the savage jungles that made up 90% of the wilds. His parents had tried to hide him for years, but the eye of King Erez was relentless. The feral king, as he is known, was disgusted when he realized Yekuthiel had lived in his kingdom for so long at such a pitiful level. Yekuthiel's last visions of his home were his mother crying as guards dragged him away from his parents. Kicking and screaming would do nothing, so he sagged in defeat even as he was hurled into the jungle that surrounded his home. If he tried to return without reaching flame, he would be killed. Yekuthiel knew all too well he would never even make ember. He would die out here, all because the cruel king thought weak people made a weak kingdom. Disgust rose in Yekuthiel's throat the more he thought of King Erez. What a monster! Why did the layers above allow him to rule? If he had been born in Nocturne or Sanctum, would he be living in safety right now? The only plus side to being a Cole out in the jungle was that the Sethra beasts couldn't feel his presence as well as other creatures. He was able to survive for weeks hunting small animals with a similar strength to himself. They were insects compared to the beasts that roam the feral wilds, overlooked, just trying not to get stepped on. Yekuthiel had a small fire going. He was cooking a rabbit-like creature over it, eyes darting around him at all times, looking for danger. His senses were sharp and his body fit, but no matter how many times he tried, he could never seem to break through to ember. Many times in the past, he had overheard his parents talking about him. Sometimes they would refer to him as a burnt soul. He had learned it was a term used to describe people who couldn't make it past Cole, a major Sethra deficiency that one could be born with. If he really was a burnt soul, could he ever truly gain power? As his mind was distracted, the tree behind him began to bend downward under the weight of a beast. Hearing the creaking of the wood, Yekuthiel quickly turned and looked up. The poor Cole boy was face to face with a foot-tall ape-like Sethra beast with hungry eyes, curled horns sprouting just above its temples, and claws resembling those of tigers that looked sturdy enough to cleave metal. Yekuthiel had never felt a fear like this, the hair on his neck and arms rising instantly, a harsh screaming wail of terror ripping out of his lungs as he turns away quicker than he had looked. He runs away into the thick brush as fast as he can, not wanting to look back, but he knows the beast is bounding after him faster than he could ever run. With his heart pumping and tears streaming down his cheeks, he turns to face the beast, hands forward, begging the world for help, and begging his Sethra to emerge. A glint of orange and red fire bristles out of his fingertips as the beast's clawed hand swings down toward Yekuthiel's face. Nocturne was a realm much different from Sanctum. The sky was plunged into an eternal night, a sea of stars hanging around a large moon that took up most of the view. A white spark of Sethra shoots into the sky for just a moment. In the middle of one of Nocturne's forests, a circle carves itself into the dirt and flashes with power. Zev and Mira appear in the center of the traversal ring, stumbling out and falling to the ground, panting and drenched in sweat. Zev's head was spinning as he looked around the new landscape. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tall, dark-wooded trees are covered in deep blue pine needles. Tree-sized and wide-capped mushrooms that hung over them, glowing teal spots surround the black, slick exterior. The ground they sat on was damp, and muddy spots and small pools of water were almost as common as the turquoise grass. Mira gets to her feet first, looking around at the wonder. Faint wisps of white and blue Sethra dance around in the air above. Mira looks down at Zev and reaches her hand out to him. This is amazing. I've read about Nocturne, but I don't think anything could have prepared me for this. It's gorgeous. Zev takes her hand and stands up. It's also really dark. Is this really what night is? Mira looks up into the sky past the mushroom caps and pine trees and says, that big rock, that must be the moon. I've read so much about it. I think that's where most of the light down here comes from. Wow, maybe keep your voice down a little bit, Mira. We don't know where we are. Nerves come back to grip the tired boy. Sorry, it's just that I've spent so many days reading about all this stuff to actually finally see it. It's like a dream come true. Her crystalline eyes shine, staring at the moon. Zev can't help but feel happy for her. She had already done so much for him. Now that their journey has truly started, he is set on finding Simon, bringing him home, and then continuing to help Mira as long as she needs him. His eyes shift around to see strange animals scampering around the dew-covered grass. Look at that. I've never seen a creature like that before, he says, pointing to the closest one that seemed to be cautiously sniffing in their direction. Mira's eyes moved down quickly to lock onto the strange little creature. It was a foot tall and resembled a deer with a single straight horn coming from its forehead. Filled with excitement, Sethra fills her eyes, turning them pure white as she calmly states her ability. Scan. Zev watches closely as the creature runs off in skittish fear. Mira's eyes lose their glow, but her beaming expression of joy remains. She turns to Zev, pointing in the direction of the fleeing creature. That cute little animal, it was a Sethra beast, an Ember level 1. Water type 2. Can you believe that? Zev recalls the Inferno level beast he had seen invade Sanctum. Really? There's barely any Sethra beasts in Sanctum. We should really be careful out here. The thought now wouldn't leave his mind. What else could be out here? Mira hears the caution in Zev's voice and nods, walking with him quietly, trying to find any signs of human life. As the two of them weave between trees and stems, they try to avoid large areas of mostly water and mud. After only an hour of searching, the sky began to weep over them, rain falling and shocking their senses instantly. Zev jumped at the feeling as a droplet landed on his forehead, wiping it away quickly before getting sprinkled with a few more. Mira, while startled for a split second, looks back to the sky, pushing her glasses up, trying to watch the rain as it fell, but ending up with wet spectacles quickly. Zev grabs her by the hand and rushes over to stand underneath a larger mushroom that stands taller than most of the pines. The cap of the mushroom now sounds like a chaotic drum as the water beats on it from above more powerfully. Zev leans back against the stem and slides to sit down by it. Mira watches the rain crash all around them from the safety of the mushroom umbrella. This is incredible. It's a lot more harsh than I imagined. This sound is going to split my head if it gets any worse, Zev says in a joking tone, trying to keep his thoughts light. It's not that bad, but it might get old if what I read is true. Apparently this rain happens every few hours here. She takes a seat next to Zev, still watching the grass around them get drenched. For how long? A few hours from what I remember. She gives Zev a nervous smile. Zev takes a deep breath and leans his head back against the slick black stem before staring up at the underside of the cap. So we just have to wait it out here, unless we can think of something better. I didn't know how prepared we would have to be. I brought a few tools and things in my satchel, but nothing can stop this from drenching us. She scans the area for anything else that might help. Zev joins in, both of them trying to think as they look around. Zev suddenly sits up straight and says, "Hey, one of the weird trees with the round tops? It must be a baby, it's so tiny. I bet we could carry it." He pointed to a small mushroom with a cap just big enough to cover them both. "And that tree over there has tons of fallen branches. With your string, Sethra, I bet you could bind 2 handles on it to make it easier to carry in no time." Hearing that made Zev's heart clench with a bit of pride. He could do that easily. A smile spreads across his face. "I'll grab the round treetop. You get the branches." "Mushroom cap," Mira corrected him. They both nod to each other, determined to make the makeshift umbrella quickly and continue through the rain. Mira sets her satchel under the large mushroom they were currently under before getting ready to rush out of the safety and gather up branches. Zev looks over to the smaller mushroom, a bit away from him, thinking of how he'll remove the cap and bring it back quickly. Plans jumble around in his head as he sees Mira running out to gather the branches and getting soaked in rainwater as it heavily pours. Screw it. He rushes out with her to make himself useful. He'll know what to do when he gets there. Chapter 6. Zev was standing on the stem of the oversized mushroom, his purple Sethra strings clutched around the top of it just under the round cap. It was perfectly sized to shield him and Mira from the rain, if he could just get it to come off. It was so much more sturdy than he imagined, looking at it from afar. Mira was already back under the gigantic mushroom that dwarfed even the taller trees, watching him and starting to get a bit nervous as he struggled. Zev looks back and catches her expression, a shiver running up his spine as he calls out over the pattering rain, "Don't worry, I got this." His heels dig into the shroom as he pulls harder, trying to sever the top of the stem. Zev knew why he was struggling so much. His strings were still barely physical, mostly made up of his Sethra. If he wasn't fully focused on them, they would lose what little physical form they had and seep into the mushroom before getting dissipated by its simple and natural Sethra flow. It had only happened a few times, causing Zev to fall to the mud, but it was a strange sensation each time. It was as if, for a brief moment, his and the mushroom's Sethra overlapped, like he was getting a small taste of the natural energy. If he wasn't so focused on needing to pop this cap off, he would think about that sensation further. Zev drew up all the Sethra he could into his hands, strengthening and reinforcing his strings to their limits as he gripped them tighter. His arms started to feel like they were on fire, the burning feeling traveling up them and reaching into his chest as his heart pumped faster, as if he were about to burst at the seams. "Now, come on, get off, you damn mush whatever." The purple energy strings saturate with more color, and they harden, becoming more real around the stem. Zev imagines Simon's spiral constriction technique and wonders if his strings could do anything like that. With his mind racing and nerves bubbling up his gut, Zev yanks his hands back and commands, "Constrict." The strings quickly tighten around the stem, getting harder and more firm until finally bursting through it and dissipating quickly. Zev wobbles a bit, landing on his back as the cap slides off the stem and falls toward him. With a roll to the side, he narrowly dodges it as mud splatters around him and rain now beats down on his back. Zev gets up to his feet, grabbing the cap and dragging it back to the safety of the large tree-like mushroom that Mira stood under. He was huffing, panting, and soaked in water and mud, but he had done it. Mira's eyes were scanning him to make sure he was okay as he flopped the cap upside down near her pile of branches and sticks. Zev slowly turns to her and brushes himself off a bit, even though that didn't really help, before he calmly speaks through heavy breaths. "You ready to get started? I think this is all we'll need." 2 copies of Mira rush towards Zev as his vision blurs and starts to go black. Her voice muffles and she calls out to him as his consciousness fades. When Zev finally starts to wake up, he finds himself staring yet again at the giant underside of the tallest mushroom cap they had found safety under. His vision was a bit hazy, but slowly returned as he heard Mira sit up straight and start nudging his shoulder. "Zev? Hey, wake up. How are you feeling?" "I feel." He sits up gently and feels his head spin and heat resting in his whole body. "Fine, mostly. A little dizzy, I guess." "Zev, you need to be more careful. You can't just will yourself to be able to handle more Sethra like that. You could have gotten seriously hurt." Zev winces a bit at her tone, shifting into anger. "I got the job done and I'm fine. Besides, you pushed me plenty just to get me to flame. I can't stop now." Mira sighs and leans back a bit. "I was 100% sure you were ready each time I pushed you forward." Zev thinks on her words, knowing they were true, and gives a soft nod. But even so, he rubs a hand down his face and repeats, "I can't stop now. I want to find Simon with you. I've already set my mind to it, but I want you to be in one piece when we do." Her tone softened a bit. Zev slowly gets up to his feet, just a little bit shaky as he gives her a lopsided smile. "Yeah, you're right. Let's stay here for a couple of hours and rest. We can start moving again then." Mira looks up at him and joins his smile, gesturing over to the pile of sticks and the mushroom cap nearby. "We'll rest and then pull this junk into something handy safely without you overdoing it." Her laugh was a bit more light-hearted now that she could see he was all right. The next few hours were spent relaxing under the giant mushroom. Mira was watching and scanning the wildlife and plants here. Zev mostly rests his aching muscles and head. He looks around his bare arms, finding strange burn-like marks in scattered lines around his upper arms, with a few on his forearms as well. Marks of using more Sethra than his body could currently handle, he was sure, but this had to be good news as well. It meant that he had enough Sethra to push farther already. He just needed to learn how to properly harness it. It wasn't until the rain started to lighten up, and more Sethra beasts came out to graze, that Mira's expression started to shift into one of confusion. Zev noticed and gets up, starting to stretch his refreshed body out. What's the matter? I just find all these ember-level beasts kind of odd. They're so skittish, but I can't tell why. If there was something out here to be scared of, wouldn't we have at least heard or seen something by now? Her voice was lower than before as a bit of fear sparked in her. Zev thought about it and looked at the cute little single-horned deer creatures as they seemingly hid from them while grazing. The light pattering of rain was growing less and less by the moment, but for some reason he had a feeling of unease swelling in his gut. Maybe we should, he began to speak while turning his attention back to Mira, but froze mid-sentence with an icy shock before a harsh shout ripped from his throat. Mira, turn around! Chapter 7. Yekuthiel's eyes shot open as a scream flung from his lungs. Visions of tiger-like claws raking through his body filled his mind as he sat up in an unfamiliar place. The terrain around him was rocky, with only a few scattered trees and towering grey and black mountains raised to the smoke-filled sky as far as his eyes could see. The boy looks down at his hands, then uses those hands to feel his body. He was intact. He was alive. On a new layer, he had been reborn. His skin was slightly more pale and grey. His long brown hair had shifted into a deep crimson colour, but most shocking were his ears. He felt them as they stuck out horizontally on both sides of his head, a few inches in length, ending in a point and drooping down slightly. Yekut had never gone to school properly, so he had little clue what any of these changes meant. He only knew he was on a lower layer than where he had been killed by that monstrous creature. Getting to his feet, the young boy started to walk through the desolate plains around him, eyes fixed on the mountains that seemed to trap the world he was placed in. Once Yekuthiel's eyes made it to the ground, curiosity washed over him. The ground had very little nature, mostly dirt, stone, and strange blackened spots. It was while examining one of these spots that a loud ringing of thunder boomed all around him, making his hands fling to his large, sensitive ears, and his eyes clenched shut from the flash that temporarily blinded him. Shaken with fear and cowering in place, Yekuthiel slowly opened his eyes to see the new blackened patch of dirt, a mere 20 feet in front of him, where the flash had struck the ground. He struggled to get himself to move. What if another flash came and struck him? He built the courage to take a step forward, but just as he did, a voice hissed from behind him. "Boy, what are you doing out here?" Yekuthiel turned to the voice with a scream of terror, both hands out toward it as if to beg for mercy. But only one thought truly went through his mind. Don't let them hurt you again. Yekuthiel then felt a feeling he had never felt before, as Sethra poured out of his hands in a burst of roaring flames that covered the stranger before he could even remember their face. Heat filled Yekuthiel's body quickly as the flames swarmed around the stranger, who began to yell out in agonizing pain and convulse in the fire. Even as the shock of using Sethra gripped the young boy, his thoughts blazed just as intensely. Don't let them hurt anyone ever again. His cry of fear and newfound power sang harmoniously with the screams of horror coming from the target of his emotions. Yekuthiel felt his arms start shaking, pain ripping through them as flames licked up his forearms. He stopped releasing his Sethra immediately. His arms burned with scorching pain, not just one type of burn, but multiple. Sethra burn marks in scattered lines all along his upper arm went down toward his forearm and hands, which were covered in more natural burns. Yekuthiel fell to the ground, writhing on his back and holding his arms to his chest as his Sethra flames burned away into the air, leaving the stranger nothing but a pile of burnt flesh and bones, lying on the ground by the boy. His eyes filled with hot tears, and the world around him became a chaotic blur as a second flash of light filled the air, followed by another boom of thunder echoing between the mountains. Yekuthiel's ears were ringing as he saw the blurs of multiple looming figures moving in around him. With a few blinks, he saw the face of a shocked woman standing over him, the same pointed ears as his draped on the sides of her head. She began to look around at others like she was shouting something the boy could not hear, as the ringing and rushing of blood in his ears wouldn't stop. He closes his eyes as he feels himself lifted over a broad shoulder. His mind couldn't take the pain any longer, and Yekuthiel passes out. Yekuthiel woke up in a warm room made of grey stone, with nooks carved into the walls holding candles, and a door made of metal bars shut in front of him. He was sitting on a bed made of stone with a large cushion over it. The cushion was stuffed with a beast's feathers inside of some kind of rough natural fabric he had never felt before. To his surprise, his arms were sore, but he felt fine other than that. Burn scars covered his hands and shoulders. He seemed to be dressed in a sleeveless brown and blue tunic made of a similar fabric as the cushion. Yekuthiel makes his way to the metal bars of the door and peeks around the hallway that seemed to wrap around outside the room. A tall and very wide man sat in a stone chair to the left of the door, his eyes raised to meet the boys. He wore a similar rough tunic, his short curly hair was a deep brown, and his eyes were an icy sky blue. He had the same pale grey skin as Yekuthiel and the same long pointed ears that drooped to the sides. He stood and walked over to the door, looking down at the boy like a mammoth in comparison as he spoke. "You're finally awake. We've got a lot of questions for you, little guy." Yekuthiel stutters through his words. "We? How many of you are there?" As he remembers the multiple figures that surrounded him before he lost consciousness. "Plenty. The rock tribe is among the strongest in all of Voltara, kid." The large man crossed his arms and eyed the boy suspiciously before continuing. "You're a Nesharin. You must know what this symbol is." He gestures to the crest on his tunic, which resembles two spread wings. Yekuthiel looked at the crest in confusion before shaking his head. "I don't know what a Nesharin is, sir." The man scrunched his face a bit, pointing up to his ears. "Well, you're not a damn human. Look at your ears. What's the point in lying to me?" "I'm not a human?" A genuine confused shock sprouted on the boy's face, and the large man softened. "Razorin, help me! Are you a reborn child?" Yekuthiel looks down to the stone floor and says, "I came from Layer 3, but I was a human." His memories of home played out in his mind as the man thought to himself over this information. Features usually change when a rebirth occurs, but for a human to actually become a Nesharin, well, it's very rare. "I don't know how your end came about up there, but it is believed that that does play a role in the rebirth process." Yekuthiel looks back up to meet the man's gaze. "It does? Some say it's destiny, and seeing you here, I'd be inclined to believe him. The name is Gavriel. What should I call you, you reckless little flame?" Yekuthiel felt his head almost pop right off his shoulders as he got closer to the bars in a jolt. "Flame? What do you—" He pauses and takes a gulp, clearing his head. "Yekuthiel, sir. But I'm no flame. I was a coal when I—" He trails off a bit as Gavriel's face twists in irritation and then shock. Joy spread across Gavriel's cheeks. A burnt soul, with no reason to lie about it. Oh ho ho. Zivo's going to need to hear of this immediately. "Stay put, Yekuthiel. I'll bring you a meal when I return." Yekuthiel backed up and sat down on the bed provided in his cell. It's not like he could even go anywhere. What did Gavriel think he was going to do? And why did he sound so damn happy about him being a burnt soul? All that had ever meant for Yekuthiel was pain and separation. He never even explained why he thought Yekuthiel was a flame. But as he sat and really thought about it, the fire he blasted out at that stranger, a coal, not even an ember, could have done that. Yekuthiel regretted it now. He had just been scared, and his fear had morphed into rage. It was ugly, but it was powerful. A burnt soul reborn straight into a flame. A gruff feminine voice called out from across the bars. Yekuthiel looked startled to see the excited woman standing with her hands on her hips. She wore the same brown and blue tunic as Gavriel, and her appearance matched his almost perfectly, aside from her curly hair being down to the middle of her back and draped around her shoulders down her chest. He could only assume this was Ziva, the woman Gavriel went to talk to. The overly enthusiastic lady grips the bars and sticks her face against them, looking Yekuthiel up and down. "We have so much to talk about, kid. Let's get you out of here and into a real room." Yekuthiel stood up and held his hands out. "Aren't you upset with me? I hurt someone, one of your—" He was cut off by Ziva quickly. "Eton was soft. The only good thing he ever did was lead me to you, and in his place I'll adopt you into the tribe." Her voice was cold toward the man he had burned alive, while she had a fiery thrill beneath it that she couldn't mask. Ziva leaned back from the bars, unlocking the door and gesturing to Yekuthiel as it swung open. "Come, little brother, I'll show you around the rock tribe." Yekuthiel took a cautious step forward. Could this really be a place where he was wanted? A family that looked to him as a real asset? He took another step, and another, until Ziva was leading him down the stone halls of the rock tribe. Chapter 8. The giant, sticky tongue lashes out 12 feet from the mouth of the Sethra beast, clutching itself on the giant mushroom stem. The Sethra beast was a 9-foot-long chameleon. Its 2 toes gripped the stem as its head lurched forward aggressively. Mira dives forward into a roll, spinning around and kneeling up next to Zev, looking up at the predator as its tongue slams the ground where she had just been. It quickly whips back into the creature's mouth, ripping up the dirt and mud powerfully. Its head jitters slightly to the side, one small eye swirling around until locking onto them and focusing again. Mira's diamond-like eyes light up with her Sethra scanning the beast as fast as she can before shouting out, "It's a flame! Let's split up!" Mira rushes to the right as Zev calls out an understanding agreement and darts to the left of the creature. The chameleon beast jerks its head forward and follows them with the eyes on the side of its head, one precise black bead for each of them. Making a swift, seemingly calculated decision, the beast leaps off of the mushroom with the strength of a big cat, chasing down Mira quickly, mouth open, ready to lash out another strike from its sticky tongue. Zev watches, skidding to a stop and trying to think. His muscles were all still on fire from overdoing it with his Sethra earlier. Did the beast know that? Mira swivels and puts a hand in front of her silently. Black Sethra swirled around her fingers and blasted out at the feet of the creature. Erecting from the ground came a black dome of energy. Clumsily, the sprinting beast ran into the dome before slowing to a stop in the center of it. It was barely big enough to contain the creature, but it stayed inside, staring at the ground and tilting its head at odd angles like it was seeing something in the dirt. Zev takes the opportunity to run over to Mira's side. She was panting and sweating, her hands shivering as she maintained the illusory dome around the creature. "Get the cap and let's run. We can't fight this thing right now." Her voice was shaking softly. "Got it." Zev said to stay as calm as he could while taking off toward the cap, lifting it up with both hands and placing the center on top of his head to help support it while he carries the thick mushroom top. Mira nods to him and starts to back up into the light rain, trying to maintain the illusion around the beast. Unfortunately for the both of them, when she looked to the dome, the beast was no longer inside, or anywhere in sight for that matter. Mira drops the Sethra dome as fast as she can, looking around herself and trying to sense the creature. Zev shivers, realizing he is in a vulnerable position now. A branch crunching behind him was the only warning he got before hearing the wind whipping around the flinging tongue barreling toward his back. Zev drops the cap behind him a bit too slowly in a vague attempt to avoid the sticky tongue. The powerful tongue slams into Zev's back, knocking the wind out of him with a harsh crunch sound. The cap falls back heavily on the tongue, sticking to the top of it, along with the back of Zev's shirt. Mira cries out, "Zev, get out of your shirt, now!" Zev tries to catch his breath while desperately grabbing at the knife he kept in a sheath on his lower back. The beast started retracting its whip-like tongue quickly, sending Zev and the cap flying toward its open maw. Zev felt the wind zipping around him as he grabbed the collar of his shirt, tugging it forward and shoving the knife up through it to bust the sturdiest part of the material. He was just about to slam into the creature's mouth when he tore through the weak part of his shirt and got sent flying out of it, rolling across the mud near the beast's 2-toed feet, narrowly missing it as the cap slammed into its face, making it back up and shake its head in a daze as it shook the hit off slowly. Now shirtless and still gripping the knife, Zev slowly wobbled to his feet in the muddy terrain, his eyes locked on the creature's leg near him. His Sethra may be exhausted, but adrenaline had fixed his physical problems momentarily. Zev lets out a yell of anger, leaping forward and jamming his knife into the beast's left ankle deeply, his right hand gripping the handle until his knuckles were white, and his left hand forcing the bottom of the handle deeper in with the sounds of cracking and clicking. The chameleon beast rears up and roars out a squeaky, pained cry, its colors shifting quickly from green and yellow to a dark red and blue. "You're going down," Zev shouts, ripping his knife through the beast's ankle and spraying thick red blood all over the mud under them, causing the creature to lean over to its right side too far. It falls hard on its side, lashing out its limbs and tail violently. Zev tried to keep up this aggressive momentum and finish the monster for good. That's what Simon would have done if he were here. The chameleon's tail uncurls and whips out, striking him in the chest and sending Zev shooting backwards toward Mira like a ragdoll. Mira braces herself and catches Zev with a heavy grunt as her heels dig into the dirt for a moment before they both end up flung down onto the ground, sprawled out. Mira stood up before Zev could. She watched as the beast stood up with a limp. Its darker red and blue colors shift around in a mesmerizing pattern before the whole creature seems to shift out of existence right in front of her. Sweat ran down her face as she watched the ground for signs of movement or traces of blood. She got a good mental image of the creature even without seeing it thanks to Zev's blow. Mira grabs her weapon of choice off of her back, a long bow with an arrow at the ready, moving to the side as she tries to distance herself from Zev and grab the creature's attention. "You can't hide from these eyes, you bastard," she calls out loud enough for the beast to hear before letting the arrow loose toward where she was sure it was. The hue-changing Sethra beast lets out another high-pitched roar of pain as its red and blue color flickers back into existence, an arrow buried deep into its left shoulder, almost a clean pierce on the neck just inches off. Its cries of pain turn into an enraged shriek as it starts to sprint at Mira. Even through its limp, the speed was frightening. Mira takes a step back, knocking an arrow and loosing it quickly at the creature, right as it leaps like a panther hungry for its kill. Her arrow slams into its chest, but it doesn't stop the beast from pinning her to the ground with its two-toed grip around her waist. The back of her head hits the ground, and she shivers in a dazed state, bow flinging a few feet away from her as she grips an arrow in her hand tightly. The beast opens its mouth, lurching down at her. It was only this close that she could see the hundreds of tiny, razor-sharp teeth that lined the inside of its maw. Help me." Her voice was hoarse with fear as she helplessly stabbed at the chameleon's thick jaw with the arrowhead. Zev stood up, finally catching his breath once again, as he saw the beast pounce onto Mira and lurch over her like it just couldn't wait for a bite of its dinner any longer. Zev knew his body couldn't make it to them in time. Even if he could never stop that beast's jaws. His heart clenches in his chest as both hands move forward, purple energy swirling from his hands all the way up to his face. One thought was raging in his mind. "You will not take her from me." "Stop!" Zev shouts with a fear that swelled from deep within him. Purple strings shoot from each one of his fingers, surging through the air in an instant and slamming into the creature's back, each in a different spot running up the spine. Unlike before, these strings were not physical at all. They were pure Sethra due to his weakness at the moment. Each one pierced into the creature, and instantly Zev was flooded with an overwhelming feeling, like his soul was shoved into a bowl with the beasts, and now they were being violently whisked together. Zev let out a scream of pain, his arms flaring with purple energy and burning, and his neck starting to get the same treatment. His fingers twitch, holding the strings in the beast's back like a crude marionette puppet. The beast froze just before it could bite down on Mira's head, its eyes twitching and moving in confusion. Its jaw started to slowly start closing for the bite, the Sethra strings creaking and starting to snap one by one. "What an interesting sight," a cool, calm, and soft male voice said from above them. Standing on top of a smaller mushroom was a very feminine man with long, flowing silver hair hanging all the way down to his backside. He wore a dark blue outfit with golden trim, a matching slick cloak rested over it, and an extra wide-brimmed hat sat on his head stiffly, made of the same slick material. He raises a gloved hand in the air and twirls it like a magician, gathering up misty water Sethra around his hand before making a finger gun with the Sethra gathered at the tip of his pointer finger, aimed right at the beast's head. Bang! The word resonates through them all, sending a shiver through Zev as all his strings snapped at once. The water Sethra shoots from his finger at a blinding speed, hitting the creature directly in the temple. In an instant, Zev's eyes shoot back to the creature at the bursting sound. His mouth drops open in shock as he sees the chameleon-like body flying off of Mira and slamming into the stem of the giant mushroom. Head nowhere to be seen as blood rained down around them both as if trying to match the light drizzle still coming down from the sky. Mira shivers and slowly sits up, watching the silver-haired man glide down gracefully from one of the lower mushroom caps and land between them, just as the creature's blood finishes showering down. His cool blue eyes dance between them before he speaks through their shock. "That was quite the close one, wasn't it?" Zev collapses to the ground in pain, clutching his arms close as new Sethra burns are freshly all over him yet again, even up his shoulders and neck. The man watches and clicks his tongue. "Oh, you two aren't looking too hot. You should come back to town with me." Mira stands up and runs over to Zev's side, looking up at the strange man while trying to help Zev up. "Who are you, sir? Thank you so much for saving us." Her voice was still shaking. The man gives a wide, amused smile. "Me? Oh dear, well, you may call me Lavon." Chapter 9. 2 years had passed since Yekuthiel had been reborn into Layer 6 Voltara. His growth had come quickly. It took only 4 months to hit Inferno, and in the remaining 20 months, he had reached the peak of his power level as an Inferno. At only 15 years old, he was the strongest member of the Rock Tribe by far. His fire Sethra could bring anyone to their knees here. Yekuthiel learned much living among the tribe. None of them knew how to reach Nova. The only Nova in Voltara was the Sethra beast they treated as a god, Reborn. The beast was a 30-foot eagle that was seemingly made of lightning Sethra. He had only seen Reborn twice, each time on the annual Rock Tribe Festival, in which Reborn was worshipped and given offerings of food and lesser electric Sethra beasts at the top of the mountain they lived inside of. Everyone referred to the mountain as the Rock. The members of the tribe were all power-hungry soul kindlers who shamed the weak and praised Yekuthiel for his strength. They all reminded him of King Erez in that way. He hated it, but he kept those feelings internal. Gavriel and Ziva were the two strongest infernos next to him, and they would do anything at the snap of his fingers. By all means, he was the leader of the Rock Tribe now. His world had been flipped upside down so quickly. Yekuthiel was sitting in a large stone chair, looking down at his notes. They were sprawled out around his desk, ink stroked around the pages in frustrated passion. His new room was the largest among the tribe, adorned with fine fabrics and decorations depicting Reborn's wings, the crest of the Rock Tribe. Yekuthiel was a bright boy, and with the help of the best healer and most knowledgeable of the layers, Natan, he learned many things about the layers above. Yekuthiel already understood traversal thanks to Natan. He had even practiced a few times making his way up to Layer 5, Loch, which was easy at his current power level. If only he could figure out what hump was keeping him from attaining the power he truly wanted. Reborn, help me! He throws his ink well against the wall, shattering it in anger, and shoves the research papers to the floor in a flurry of smoking cinders. Natan rushed into the room. He was a young man, 20 years old. He was the kindest of the tribe. The others tolerated his traits, seen as weakness, due to his rare life Sethra, which allowed him to heal others. Natan goes to Yekuthiel's side and puts a hand on his back. Calm yourself, Yekuthiel. His soft voice floated around the room like the melody of a mother's lullaby. Yekuthiel takes a few deep heaving breaths, looking over to his only true friend in this world. Natan's forest green short hair was frazzled from running through the silk sheet that hung over the doorway. After a moment of composing himself, Yekuthiel nods to Natan and says, "Sorry, Natan. I just don't know how those bastards did it." "How did they reach beyond Inferno? Is Nova just an illusion?" Natan laughs a bit, catching Yekuthiel's confused slight glare before nudging his shoulder. "You know, when you first arrived here, you would have never had this confidence. All the stories of Novas I've ever heard of on the higher layers say it took them decades to reach Nova. I know that already, but the longer it takes me to ascend, the longer Res can keep torturing people that are like me." His shoulders stayed stiff even as they lowered slightly. "Well, like you, you're the strongest Inferno, maybe on this entire layer now." This made Yekuthiel smile with a sense of pride. "And that's exactly why I can't stop, Natan. I will change this world forever. I will scorch the head of the beast." Natan gives a short nod and says, "I believe you will, even just spreading the true nature of burnt souls. It could change the whole system of the top layers." Yekuthiel looked down at his burnt notes all over the floor. The pages started to resemble bodies laying limp. For better or for worse, it would. "Natan, bring me mountain gear." Natan tilts his head slightly. "Mountain gear? Festival preparations won't start for many months. Just do this for me, friend, and tell no one." Natan gives another short nod, turning and leaving the room to gather up mountain gear and provisions. Yekuthiel picks up one of his papers, gazing at it and letting his thoughts ponder the option he had been scared to explore. "I can't leave any stone unturned." Zev barely remembered the journey to the fine bed he was lying in. The blue-tinted wood of the wall next to him had been his focal point for the last few minutes after waking up. He remembered Levon giving him some kind of medicine that made him fall asleep before they even reached this place. The room was well furnished, with 2 wooden bed frames a few feet apart and nice mattresses resting on top of them. A desk with a few books that seemed to be training materials for flames. As he finally started to sit up and really examine the room, he noticed the window on the other end. Zev got up and gazed outside. Blue and orange lights danced around the flattened roads. The homes sitting around the roads were made up of blue-tinted wood, and the roof seemed to be the slick black material of the mushroom caps crafted into something more stable. There were many curves in the flats of the roads that had strange metal grates. Zev had only ever seen those used for cooking, but it was clear they were draining the water around them. Children were playing in puddles, watched by their parents. "Oh, you're awake, thank goodness." Mira said it from behind him. He hadn't heard the door open, so it gave him quite the jolt. Zev turns to face her, relief swelling in his heart. "I'm so glad you're okay. I really thought our journey was over for a moment. I'm a high-level flame, just like that Sethra beast was. But I felt helpless. It was so frustrating." He nods and walks over, rubbing the back of his head. "I did something I didn't even know I could do, and that monster ripped right through it." "Without?" Lavon loudly burst through the door. "Without your new friend, Lavon?" Both of them jumped back in shock, staring at the eccentric man as he stood proudly in the doorway with his hands on his hips and a broad smile across his face. Lavon takes a few steps into the room with the ambitious youths. Zev couldn't help but recall King Oren's final warning before they traversed. "Seek guidance as soon as you can, from anyone who will help. Well, except maybe Lavon. Anyone but him." The words seemed to echo in his head as the cheery, thin man looked at him and Mira with a fiery curiosity in his gaze. Mira starts to say something, but Lavon cuts her off. "Are you two from Sanctum?" Zev looks at Mira with a bit of shock, then stares at Lavon, answering, "Yes, we've come on personal missions. My brother is down on layer 4. I'm going to find him." Lavon's eyes widen with surprise. He crosses his arms, one hand going to his chin, stroking at it in thought. "Oh my, please, go on. I'd like to hear all the details before I help you." Mira steps forward. "I don't think we want your help, sir. King Oren suggested it would be best to avoid you." This causes Lavon to drop his thoughtful stance and start laughing, his hand dropping to rest on his flat belly. "Oh my, that is a treat, I must say. I assure you, you two couldn't be more lucky to have had me stumble upon you. I know when I sense kindlers that want true power." Zev puts his hand out in a questioning gesture. "But King Oren is." Lavon finishes the sentence. "An old lazy fossil that sits on layer 1. If you want to get to layer 4, then pay him no mind." Mira and Zev share looks one last time, as if silently debating what to do. After a short moment, they both nod and turn back to Lavon. Zev's eyes fill with determination. "Okay, I'll tell you everything." Zev goes over every detail of what's happened to him. He starts with the Inferno-level Sethra beast that killed Simon. He spares no detail, even through the painful memories. Mira adds in her side of things here and there once Zev gets to the training they did together. Lavon seemed clearly impressed with her capabilities. Once they are finished with the story, Lavon gives them a kind smile. "That is quite the tale. That beast attack is incredibly concerning. I thought I felt something strange around that time, but to think it was a beast clearly born from layer 4. He turns away from them and looks out the window. "That ability you described, an inferno could possibly imprint something like that. But in this circumstance, I think it's more likely that it was a nova. I think you can put together why that's unnerving." Lavon turns back to them, arms behind his back and a stern look on his face, gazing directly at Mira. "Because there are only 4 known novas in the known 4 layers," she speaks through her thoughts, feeling a chill up her spine. "And not a single one of those novas wields fire, Sethra. Perhaps for the first time in hundreds of years, we have a nova from the lower layers making moves." His stern look morphs back into a wide smile, as if this were enjoyable news. Zev feels the hair on the back of his neck start to stand on end. This man looked crazy, but he knew the names of the 4 known novas: King Oren, Queen Layla, King Erez, and Lavon. He couldn't turn down the help of a nova, not after the wake-up call that was the fight with that chameleon beast. With a deep breath, he calmly says, "So, you're saying we need to start training immediately?" The amused smile on Lavon's face grows wider before he walks back over to the door. "You learn quickly, don't you? Follow me." He guides them through the well-furnished halls of his estate and toward the center, a wide open courtyard. It was reminiscent of the garden in King Oren's castle, if it had been stripped of all greenery and flattened into a training ground. Young soul kindlers were hitting blue wooden dummies with physical attacks as well as Sethra. The walls are lined with kindlers in many different meditation poses. The largest section was the ring in the center of the courtyard that seemed to be used for sparring. Two high-level flames are currently battling it out with sparks of light wisping around the air between gusts of wind. Levon turns to his two new pupils, stretching his arms out wide, showing off his work. Welcome to my home, Crater. Chapter 10. Yekuthiel was calmly walking down the great steps of the rock. His tunic was blasted to bits hanging from him, and his chest carried a wild lightning-patterned burn mark. His breaths were heavy, as each step sent pain through his body. At the bottom of the mountain, many Nesharin of the rock tribe waited for him. Shocked looks across their faces. Yekuthiel stopped at the top of the final set of steps and looked down upon his tribe with a new spark behind his eyes. Over the last 3 years, he had gone up the mountain every single day to speak with Reborn. The tribe did not like it at first, seeing it as an offense to their god, but none dared to stop Yekuthiel. And now he was seen as the one true prophet of Reborn. His word was God's word, and he had never once come down the mountain in such a state. Blood dripped from his pointed ears and fresh burns festered on his torso and arms, yet his eyes held passion the rock tribe had yet to see from their young leader in the last 3 years. Yekuthiel raised his arms to the sky and looked out among the familiar faces. He found disgust for them in his heart, but his words ripped across the tribe like bolts of Rezorin's lightning, striking true in their hearts and minds. I am the prophet of Rezorin, the burnt soul, your fearless leader that has never once wavered among the wars of the tribes that would see us taken from our place atop the rock. Flames began to whip out from behind Yekuthiel's back, rising and spreading until wide eagle-like wings of fire stretched around him. Without a word of notice, I am the light that will shape all of Voltara into our domain. Starting today, Natan stood in the crowd, his face pale with shock as the thoughts raced through his mind. Has he really attained that power in only 3 years? Our reign will not stop at Voltara, my brothers and sisters. We will show the layers above the strength of Rezorin. We will show them my light. Yekuthiel's eyes begin to burn a bright orange color, along with his fiery wings, as he gives a flap and lifts into the air. The harsh, hot wind blasting along the faces in the crowd made them shield themselves, yet none could look away. Avriel takes a step forward, gripping the warhammer on his back and raising it into the air, letting out a loud cry of celebration. Ziva steps after him, raising her twin blade and joining in. The previous leaders of the tribe got the whole rock yelling in excitement for their current leader's newfound strength. No one would stand in the way of the rock tribe now. Mira was sitting in her meditation pose next to Zev, who stood in his own pose. Levon was across from them as they had their backs to the wall in the courtyard. They had lived in Crater for 2 whole months already, but the time flew by so quickly around them due to Levon's intense training regimens. The easy part of the training was building up Sethra through hours of meditation. The hard part was Levon having them sit alone in rooms writing poetry and journaling every day. The goal was to have them be in tune with your inner self. The strangest of the training was what Levon called Sethra manipulation training. For a few hours, he would have all of his students produce their energy and use it in unique ways to try to learn unconventional uses or abnormalities. Zev had mentioned the strange sensation of his Sethra strings entering the chameleon beast, so most of this training for him was running his strings through random plants and trying to maintain a connection with them. It felt strange each time, but he began to get used to the feeling of his Sethra mixing around with foreign energies. Mira, on the other hand, already knew exactly what her knowledge of Sethra could do, so her training was more combat-focused, specifically around her bow. Stop, Levon said calmly, causing both of them to snap out of their meditation and look to him. Mira, you've hit the peak of your flame ability to generate Sethra. You're as strong as you'll get without ascending. Mira stands up with an excited glow behind her eyes. So, I'm ready to start developing my own technique, finally? Levon gives her a quick nod, but before he can say another word, she turns away from him and tosses a few books from her stuffed satchel onto the ground, soon surrounded by notes upon notes of research. Levon laughs and walks over to Zev's side, clapping a soft hand on his shoulder. Most students give it at least some thought, but she is ridiculous. Zev had a warm expression, looking over Mira, deep in her books. I wouldn't expect anything less from Mira. I wish I could say I've thought about it that hard. Levon takes his hand from Zev. You're getting close to the peak yourself. I have to say you two have impressed me almost every single day you've been here. Zev's heart swells with pride as a smile cracks across his face. I've had nothing but amazing teachers. That's why I can't stop. Simon needs me. Oh, yes. How long has he been in Romtara? Zev felt his stomach turn slightly. He's been in Layer 4 for a little over 6 months now, sir. And in just over 6 months, you've gone from coal to almost the peak of flame? Not to mention your strange age, there's something very peculiar about you, Zev. Unlike when he was younger, this no longer sounded like an insult. It was praise, and it washed over him. Before Zev could continue talking with his teacher, a brown cloaked figure seemingly fell from the sky, landing in the center of the courtyard. Levon turned to face the figure and gave quite the exaggerated gasp. Sar? To what do I owe the pleasure? Sar stood a bit shorter than Zev, a stubby, wide man with darker tan skin and a scratchy beard to match his short black hair. His eyes were a rich chocolate color, cold and hardened. Mira and Zev's attention was snapped to the man's studded leather armor under the cloak, covered in dagger slings, and 2 long, curved swords at his sides. His eyes glanced at them only for a moment before locking onto Levon. King Erez has sent me to gather you. He requires your presence. Me? Only me? What of my sister? Levon cocked an eyebrow. Queen Layla is not needed, only you. Levon laughed softly, shaking his head. You really have a way with words, Sar. He looks back to his 2 new pupils. I'll need 2 weeks and permission to bring along my students here. Sar's face twists in frustration. King Erez does not like these games, Levon. Come now and avoid his anger. Levon tilts his head at Sar. I believe I said what I needed to say to you. Go on and deliver my words, messenger boy. Sar's anger swells, and he lifts a hand in front of him, palm facing the ground, the dirt at his feet vibrating quickly and breaking down into fine sand in specific places. Levon didn't flinch, but Zev pressed against the wall in fear. Zev's eyes tracked the sand forming at the messenger's feet and realized he had created a traversal ring in an instant. Sar leans down on one knee, touching the center of his ring and blowing his Sethra through it while staring daggers at Levon. Levon raises one hand, casually waving. Goodbye, friend. See you in 2 weeks. The traversal ring burst into a column of white light, leaving sand scattered around the courtyard and a ring etched into the center of the sparring arena. Turns back to them and gives a cheery clap of his hands. Well then, it looks like we have 2 weeks to hit Inferno, hopefully. Zev felt his cheeks pale and his heart quicken. 2 weeks? Chapter 11. In only 2 years after attaining the power of a nova, Yekuthiel stood on the vast red sandy plains of Layer 4, Romtara. With the mountains jutting out of the crimson ground like a monster's toothy grin, he couldn't help but see the similarities with Voltara. The blazing color of the sky made a warm orange glow flow through every inch of the land. Gavriel looks around, examining the sandy, cracked ground and deep, dark pits common in the broken terrain. I think I feel at home already, Chief. Yekuthiel gave him a slight nod. These few weeks have been smooth. I couldn't have predicted that setting up rock camps would have been this easy. It seems our only true opposition really is King Erez. I don't think anyone can oppose you, Chief. Gavriel adjusted the warhammer draped over his shoulder. Suddenly, a symbol in the shape of an eye made of fire appears in front of Yekuthiel, glowing brightly and making a hiss as it fizzles out into smoke quickly. Yekuthiel looks at the sky intently. That scale reaver I sent up, it's dead. Do you think it actually made it to Sanctum? He follows Yekuthiel's gaze up. Are you questioning my research? Yekuthiel's eyes fall down on Gavriel with the weight of a blacksmith's hammer, pounding metal into the correct shape. Gavriel stiffens and straightens, quickly losing his casual stance. Of course not, my chief. It's just so far outside my realm, sir. I couldn't even fathom it. Yekuthiel made a scoff of disgust, looking away from his subordinate and toward the makeshift rock tribe camp they had erected. Ziva was in the camp shouting orders to Lessers. Feeling his fiery gaze, she turned to meet his eyes. Yekuthiel strolls into the center of camp to meet her, with Gavriel walking behind him. He speaks sternly. Ziva, gather all available kindlers. We're going to divide as far as we can and search for any reborns that may show up. Ziva didn't question his words for even a moment as she shouted out new orders around the camp. Thrill coated every yell with a bloodlust that never seemed to leave her. If someone perished in the attack on Sanctum, Yekuthiel would find out and plan accordingly. Flaming wings sprout from the Nova's back, and he lifts into the air with ease. His words washed over his tribe with commanding anger, as they always did. Find them. The world around Simon was a bright blur as he blinked repeatedly. His throat felt dry and his eyes were heavy. A scaled hand with thick claws gripped the sand in front of him as he reached forward to lift himself off the ground. It was his own hand, his vision cleared and traced from the tips of his fingers up to his shoulder. His arms were completely covered in draconic scales, just like the ones on the powerful Sethra beast he had killed. His body felt so much heavier than before. He continued examining his reborn body. His chest, belly, and face seemed as human as ever, except for the curled, long horns sticking out of his head just above his ears. Finally, he stood up, a thud on the sand to his back, calling his attention to a new scaled tail hanging behind him, so long that it rested partly on the ground. Black scales ran from the top of his legs right down to his draconic feet. Simon let out a shaken breath. His body felt so much larger, but he also had more physical strength than he had ever had before. His mind started to calm down as he remembered what happened fully. Zev's terrified expression burned into his head. He needed to secure himself and traverse to Layer 3 as soon as possible. Dragon-like body or not, he tests his new body, lifting his tail into the air and waving it slowly. That was quite the odd feeling. Just as odd was the hanging feeling tugging behind his shoulder blades. Simon's dragon wings slowly opened and spread behind him. At this point, all Simon could do was laugh at the revelation before talking to himself in a hushed tone. What kind of monster am I? Simon began to cautiously search the side of a nearby mountain for food and water, as it was one of the only areas he could see that was growing plants and some strange tall trees with wide-hanging leaves over tops of them. Simon finds a dark orange plant covered in spines sitting on the ground. It was off-putting at first, but he couldn't help but notice the round blue fruit growing from the top of the spiny nightmare. His mouth as dry as it was and his stomach gurgling, Simon plucked one of the fruits without a second thought, slicing it in half with the claw on his pointer finger. The inside was filled with tiny white seeds condensed around the center, and the flesh had a strange gelatinous texture with a semi-clear blue hue. Simon takes bite after bite until he is left with empty, scaled hands covered in watery juice. It was like eating sweet water that had been shoved into the shape of a fruit and given just enough solidity to not burst into a puddle. His hunger was still very apparent, but he felt instantly hydrated. After finishing a second fruit, Simon stiffens, hearing a laugh start up from behind him. Well now, I almost mistook you for a scale reaver, Reborn. Gavriel stood 15 feet behind the freshly reborn Simon, with a wild grin stretching across his face and a hunger in his eyes. His warhammer lifts off his shoulder, and he grips it tight in both hands. Why don't you go ahead and come with me quietly, Reborn? Simon fully turns to meet the man's gaze, a fear splintering up his spine and raising the hair on his neck. Who are you? I'm a member of the Rock Tribe. My great chief would like you gathered, so I'm here to gather you. Simon could see the lust for battle in the brute's twisted face. He takes a step back, trying to think of a plan quickly. Whoever this guy's chief was, he didn't want to meet him. I see. Yeah, I'll come with you. Gavriel doesn't let his guard down for a moment as he takes a few steps forward, hands still gripped on his weapon, ready to swing. I like a guy who knows when he's beat. His words dripped with venom as they fought to escape grit teeth. Simon leaps into the air with the newfound strength of his draconic legs, spreading his wings as he jumps. How hard could flying be? His hand shoots out to his side as he calls out for Shadow Serpent's blade. The whip-like sword of black Sethra filled the void in his palm quickly. Before Simon could attempt to stabilize himself in the air, Gavriel let out a battle cry, swinging his warhammer upward. He wasn't remotely close enough to hit Simon with the hammer, but the pure force Sethra he had gathered into the hammer shot out like a crossbow bolt, nailing Simon in the gut and sending him flying higher into the sky above the few treetops there were. Simon felt the air leave his lungs for a moment as he hung in the air stiffly. He began to plummet back toward the ground, where the Rock Tribe hunter waited at the ready. The hammer had already pulled back for another swing. Simon spreads his wings and flaps frantically, trying to slow his fall, wobbling violently in the air as his speed doesn't decrease much. Zev's face of terror flashes in his mind. Shadow Sethra was unique. It had taken Simon years to master all the strange ways he could manipulate it. His crowning achievement as a soul kindler had been how he learned to mold shadows into the physical world. He gave them shape like a sculptor, and then his Sethra gave them life. Every moment of his life was a painting, and he wielded the brush to alter it. Simon reaches his free hand forward toward the shadows on the ground, like an artist dabbing paint. Come to me. The shadows all around Gavriel caught his attention as they seemed to shift and morph. He had never seen Sethra like this. It all gathered at the base of a tree, where the shade was the densest. A bar of black shadow Sethra with enough strength to be fully physical bursts from the base of the tree and rockets towards Simon, curving into a ramp. Gavriel's eyes widened in shock at the power as Simon gripped the bar of shadow with his new clawed feet and grinded down toward the ground, turning the wild momentum into a controlled speed. Gavriel sends 2 bolts of force Sethra at Simon, but he speeds past them as they burst into the sky, slamming the side of the mountain. Simon leaps off his shadow bar, skidding toward Gavriel, claws marking the ground until they are only 10 feet apart. Shadow's serpent's blade whips forward at the man, but Simon couldn't help but feel that, for some reason, his weapon was weaker than usual. He had called out its true name, and if anything, his Sethra felt more refined than ever right now. Gavriel rams his warhammer against the whip blade, shattering it like it was made of wood, the Sethra splintering and dispersing into the shadows around them. The tall shadow bar in the air whips down at Gavriel from the sky, gathering all the energy in the technique into one blow. Gavriel's eyes shoot up to see the danger at the last moment. He raises his weapon, filling it with his Sethra to try to counter the descending, hardened shadow. Sand blasts into the sky as Gavriel flies backwards until his back hits one of the strange trees so hard that he gasps roughly and coughs up a trickle of blood, his arms shaking a bit while holding the hammer in his blocking stance. Gavriel stumbled forward with an expression of excitement cast over him through his bloody grin. "You're a strong one, Reborn. Let's see if you can handle this one." He leans back while holding his hammer horizontally before shouting out, "Kill line!" and flinging his warhammer at Simon, twirling with a speed that made the hunk of metal a straight shooting blur of silver. Simon jumps to the side of the speeding metal, and as he does, he hears a loud clank, as if the weapon had struck something mid-air. It ricocheted off of seemingly nothing and redirected right back at him. Simon shoves his hands to the ground and raises up the thickest physical wall of shadow he could in the moment of panic. Right as it raises, the weapon smashes through it like it was made of glass. Simon's shadow manipulation was impressive, but this was for Sethra. The warhammer slams into his arm with a loud crunch, sending him tumbling through the sand with a limp arm. Gavriel had a wicked smirk on his face as he reached out, grabbing his weapon with his force Sethra and pulled it back to himself. Simon stands up as fast as he can, and even with how sturdy his reborn form was, his arm is broken. Simon's normal calm focus melted away into a fury he wasn't used to. His working arm was twitching, his claws were clenching, and he was gripping at the air ready to rip and tear. "Get out of my way," he mutters under his breath, barely audible as his expression contorts into a grimace. Gavriel is stunned for a moment as he sees Simon leap at him with the ferocity of a scale reaver, his arm behind him, gathering shadow Sethra, until it resembles a dragon's claw the size of Simon's entire body. The technique was crude and unnamed, but even so, it dripped with a power Gavriel could feel shake him to his core. He pulls his warhammer back quickly, filling it with as much Sethra as he can in such a short time. The 2 soul kindlers met blows in an instant, sparks flying around the shadow claw as the warhammer is sheared in half, and blood sprays into the air. Simon stood over Gavriel's heaving body as the shadow claw faded to the ground. The fury in Simon's eyes quickly fades as he looks at the fatal wound across the man's chest. He was losing blood quickly. "I didn't mean to, I'm sorry." He leans down, pointlessly trying to apply pressure to the large wound. Gavriel gurgles a growl of disgust while gripping weakly at Simon's arm. "Don't apologize to the weak." Simon looked into the man's eyes with horror as life left them. Chapter 12. Zev stood in the center of the courtyard sparring arena across from Mira. She had the most intense look of determination he had ever seen on her. Levon paced around the edge of the ring, rubbing his hands together. He wasn't sure if either of them would actually reach this step in 2 weeks, let alone 1. "Okay, Mira, you think you've actually found the true name this time?" Mira gives a quiet nod before taking a deep breath, letting Sethra fill her hands slowly and keeping a cold focus on Zev. She raises her hand forward in a half-grip motion, like she was trying to choke him from a distance. A shiver runs through him, and he takes a single step back as he feels her energy swell to a whole new level. Her words were heavy, like the letters themselves were going to fly from her mouth to attack him. "Nightmare Cowl." A bolt of black Sethra streaks through the air right at Zev, much faster than he could move away from it. The energy hits him in the chest with force but no pain. It splashes almost like water, sticks to his skin, and surges up toward his face with the speed of a disturbed nest of spiders. Zev had maybe a second before her Sethra sealed around his head like a holeless mask, blocking off all his senses and altering them. She really had found the true name of her ability in only a week. Zev's whole world morphed in an instant. He was standing in the familiar forest near his town in Sanctum. The ground was scorched and covered in ash. A black decorated padlock hung in the air before him. Simon's soul link was shaking and cracking, the motions growing more violent by the second. Zev knew this new ability of hers used his own mind to create it. He knew she wasn't actively making him see it on purpose, but even so, Zev fell to his knees with pain in his chest. He covered his eyes, breathing heavily as he rubbed his face. He could vividly hear the soul link shattering. A grip at his ankle shocks him, and he looks down with a jolt. Simon's green eyes rested on him with desperation, his charred body sticking halfway out of the dirt and ash. His voice was ragged. "Why, Zev? Why couldn't you save me?" The real world around Zev burst back into view as her nightmare cowl dispersed from around his head. He was laid on the ground outside the bounds of the ring, with a blunt arrow resting next to him. He looks at the bruise on his chest for a moment before letting his head fall back and rest on the flat ground. Thoughts of Simon were swimming around in his head like a fishbowl. So many what-ifs, different unpredictable scenarios. In his own struggle to even create a technique or find out what he could do, he had pieces, but the puzzle was incomplete. Mira stood over him with her hands stretched down to help him up. "Are you okay, Zev? I'm sorry for whatever you saw." She sounded pained, like she wished she could have cast the ability on anyone else. But Zev held no real ill will. A spar was a spar. "Don't be silly, Mira. That was the whole point of this training. I'm fine. I just need to catch up again." He takes her hand and gets to his feet, a reassuring smile breaching the corners of his mouth. "Well, you hit the peak of flame. You just need to build a technique that feels right and find its true name now." "Oh, is that all I have to do?" He shakes his head and laughs at her eager tone. "Yes, apparently. I can feel the changes in my own Sethra already." Even the girl who had researched the topic day and night sounded a bit shocked by the revelation. Zev looked at Mira. Her ascension had brought no physical changes, but something about her just felt different. Maybe it was simply the feeling of her blooming Inferno Sethra so close to him. Zev admired her more than anyone else except maybe Simon. She was truly amazing. If Mira and Lavon couldn't help Zev reach Inferno by the end of the week, who could? Lavon steps over and smacks them both on their backs. "Good show, my lovely pupils. That's one down and one to go." Zev felt the pressure really set in now, as all focus was on him. After 3 days of no progress, Lavon takes Zev to the pine and mushroom forest around Crater. Zev follows his teacher closely, looking around at the nighttime wonder of Nocturne's nature. Zev sees a few of those strange little horned deer creatures grazing nearby. He now knows they are called water bouncers due to their skittish nature and water Sethra affinity. Lavon leans down with a hand out, lower to the ground, a ball of water slowly forming in his palm. One of the water bouncers cautiously makes its way to him and drinks from his palm, the orb of water staying condensed but starting to shrink. Lavon's voice comes out in a very calm tone to not scare the creature. "Zev, I've thought quite a bit about your fight with that sight lurker," he said, referring to the chameleon beast. Zev watches the cute creature drink while listening. "I have as well, sir. The feeling was very strange." Lavon looks up at Zev. "Indeed, from the way you describe it, it sounds intense. What's really been intriguing to me are the places your strings naturally seem to attack." Zev thought for a moment, a bit confused. "They attacked the sight lurker's back." No, I wouldn't say that. I would say they struck right at its spine. Now that, along with the feeling of mixing Sethra you described, that is interesting." Zev's eyes widen as new thoughts race through his mind. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since I saw you fight. I feel like just giving you the answer takes away from the learning. We're low on time now. I'd like you to attack this water bouncer with your strings the same exact way you did to that sight lurker." Zev hesitated for a moment before reaching both hands out and commanding, "Stop!" All 10 of his purple strings shot from his fingers and were nailed into the water bouncer's spine with no physical damage. Unlike the sight lurker, this was a much more manageable feeling as the lesser water Sethra danced along with his. Sweat still began to bead around his forehead as heat swelled in his arms and neck, but the small creature stood frozen at Levon's boots, not moving an inch. Zev felt the strangest sensation of control over the water bouncer, like it was an extension of his own body. He had felt something like this with the sight lurker, but it had been so overwhelming that he couldn't get a good grasp on it. He tries another command. Drink. The deer-like creature began to lean down and drink from Levon's hand again. Zev shudders, trying to maintain the ability without a true name. It took only a few seconds after the command for the strings to snap off the water bouncer. It hopped away in confused fear. Zev felt the heat in his arms almost burst from his skin again. Apparently he had used much more Sethra than he'd assumed while he was focused on the beast. Levon was now standing with a wide-eyed grin of satisfaction. Now that is an interesting ability you've got there. Zev rubs at one of his burning arms with a shocked smile. I can connect right to other Sethra sources and control them. That's the true nature of String Sethra. Levon grips Zev's shoulder for a moment before he walks him back toward the gates of Crater. Perhaps it is. I'm excited to see you explore the boundaries of such an interesting type. Rest for an hour, then meet me in the courtyard. The next 3 days of training for Zev were spent in the corner of the courtyard, surrounded by potted plants, and attempting to find the true name of his strange new ability. Living plants held a small amount of nature's Sethra, the same way coals technically had Sethra hidden inside them yet to be explored. Even on the weakest possible target, failing attempts to name the ability while using it still exhausted Zev quickly, giving him limited attempts per day. Zev's panic was growing by the hour as his exhaustion increased. Tomorrow was the day they were all set to traverse to Layer 3. If he wasn't an Inferno, he would never be strong enough to handle it. He would be left behind. Mira put a hand on his back. Try to calm down, Zev. Panicking and rushing isn't going to work. Zev gave her a soft, appreciative nod. Right, I know. Thank you, Mira. Mira stands in front of him and holds her hands out. The true name of my first technique came to me from something pretty silly. Sethra swelled between her hands and then formed into the illusion of a black cowl. When I was really little, I had constant nightmares after reading some scary stories. My dad told me to sleep in his cowl. He said it would absorb all my nightmares so I wouldn't have to dream about them anymore. A slightly embarrassed blush spread across her freckled cheeks. Zev's expression melts into a laughing grin. Mira squints and throws the illusory cowl at him. It splashes harmlessly against him and dissipates around into the air, vanishing. Don't laugh at me. I'm saying you need to think about your past. Even the small things shape us into who we are and who we will be. Zev puts a hand up, still laughing slightly. Calm down, I just thought it was cute. My mom was very protective of me. She did stuff like that all the time. But I can't think of any story that ties into this weird technique off the top of my head. Mira crosses her arms and thinks, well, maybe you need to change how you think about your ability. Maybe instead of a strange Sethra controlling ability, you think about it like stitching or puppetry. Zev listens as she throws out ideas to help him. Puppetry catches his ear instantly, and he holds his pointing finger up for silence. When he was younger, he and Simon would make up stories, and then he and Simon would put on shadow puppet shows for other kids. Simon did most of the work, but he always made Zev feel like he was helping. Oftentimes, he remembered getting pulled into the puppet show himself. With the thought clear in his mind, he stood over a plant, both hands hovering over it, and called out, "Shadow puppet." His string slammed into the small tree's roots in its pot. Exhaustion shot through Zev, and all his purple snapped instantly. He drops to his knees, sweating and panting heavily. I really thought I had it. He felt like he might pass out from how many attempts he had already made today. Mira leans down and helps him stand back up gently, sounding concerned for him. You need to go rest, Zev. You can try a few more times in the morning once you're refreshed. Zev was upset with himself, but he didn't argue. He gave her a nod while his eyes met the ground. She helps him to their sleeping quarters. He lays in bed and stares at the ceiling. Mira goes back to the courtyard to keep training with Levon. Zev's mind was swirling with many thoughts. The image of Simon's scorched body from the nightmare cowl played in his mind still. He squeezes the blanket on his chest tightly and speaks under his breath. I will bring you home, I promise. Chapter 13. Yakuthiel stood over Gavriel's corpse, Ziva at his side gripping her twin blade, enraged. Ziva glares at the man next to Gavriel's body with blood on his hands. Simon stared at them with pale fear. He already knew he couldn't run. But both were at least infernos, and he was pretty sure the man with the flaming wings was beyond what he could imagine. Ziva takes a step forward, raising her weapon with a growl of emotional pain. Yekuthiel throws his hand in front of her chest without breaking eye contact with the shaken man. We don't need to fight. We need the Reborn. Come to our camp. My healer will attend to your wounds. Ziva felt like she might scream, but contained herself in a harsh tone. Chief, he killed Gavriel. Indeed, he did. He's stronger than Gavriel was. Isn't that what you two were always going on about? The strong live on. Ziva looked at the red sand at her feet, the color mixed with the crimson leaking from her old friend. Simon slowly stood up, weighing his options, and slowly stepped forward to meet Yekuthiel. I'm sorry, I lost control. I didn't mean to do this. The flaming wings of the red-eyed man flapped once, exuding pressure on both of the kindlers. Gavriel was an idiot. He would have killed you before we got the chance to meet. Come. Soon enough, Simon was resting in a small tent at the makeshift rock tribe camp, and Narton was at his side, repairing his arm and tending to his minor wounds with glowing stitchings of green life Sethra. Narton's calm voice was shockingly soothing, even in this situation. He stood up as he spoke. Okay, rest for a while and don't move around too much, all right? I'll check on you in a few hours. Right, thank you, Narton. I didn't expect such a nice welcome after what happened. Well, it's only right. I help you. His tone shifted to one of guilt, and his eyes averted from Simon's confused gaze. Before Simon had a chance to ask about what that meant, Narton had already rushed from the tent, leaving him to ponder. Simon laid back and thought about how fast this had all felt. One moment he had been fighting to save Zev's life, and the next he was in Romtara fighting for his own. The confused terror on Zev's face was haunting him. As soon as he was able to, he needed to traverse up to Layer 3. After a full day of rest and visits from Narton, Simon finally emerged from the tent feeling in good health. Yekuthiel was on top of a red sandy hill with a large table covered in papers. He looked down across the camp and locked eyes with Simon. The chief lifted a hand and motioned for Simon to join him. After a moment of hesitation, Simon made his way up the hill and stood next to Yekuthiel. His eyes hovered over the drawings and notes scattered on the table. They looked like things depicting soul links and a few things that were unrecognizable to him. These are my studies. I'm sorry if my lesser shocked you. The truth of the matter is that I need a reborn to further my research. I would like to change our worlds for the better, Simon. Simon examined a drawing of a kindler holding a soul link. You must be brilliant. No one understands the true nature of soul links. To even try seems like a great feat. I've been doing experiments with Nartan for years now. We understand much more than anyone in the layers above, that is, except maybe the Novas. They seem to love hiding large truths. Simon looks across to Yekuthiel with cautious confusion. If they are hiding such things, is it possible it's for a reason? To keep people safe, perhaps? King Erez keeps no one but himself safe, and I highly doubt the other Novas care about anything below them. Yekuthiel's voice had quickly dropped into a cold tone. Simon nods and listens, feeling nerves clenching in his stomach as his eyes wander around the camp. Narton was helping people with random tasks. Ziva was stood by a scale reaver, training it like a normal dog, giving it hunks of meat as treats. Simon felt a chill roll through him. Why would they train that beast? The same beast that had invaded Sanctum. Yekuthiel notices his gaze and shaken expression. Oh, yes, I do apologize for my barbaric methods. I assume it was my dormant ability that killed you. Don't worry, Simon. I will more than make up for it. Simon was frozen with emotions he couldn't quite grasp. This man had attacked his home and killed him. He almost killed Zev. After quite a long pause of silence, he finally responds. And how will you do that? A wicked smile spread like wildfire on Yekuthiel's pale grey cheeks. Simple. I'm going to unlock your soul link. It had been 6 months since Simon had been imprisoned by Yekuthiel. Day after day, the cold-eyed Nova performed experiments on Simon's soul link. Simon had been riddled with pain almost every time they worked on him. After everything that had happened, he had thought he would die before Yekuthiel finished his experiments, but Yekuthiel had done what he set out to. Simon had seen his own soul link shatter, yet he was still alive somehow. Simon was standing alone far from the rock tribe's camp, shrouded by the shade of a mountain, crouching and catching his breath. Narton unbound him and told him to run, to traverse, before Yekuthiel could catch him. He wasn't sure why Narton had done this, or if this was just some kind of test from the Nova. Either way, he had to take his chance now that he had. His mind was rocked by what he had endured in the rock tribe's camp. Even so, he looked down at the firm ground. The whole area was covered in a dark shade, making it easy to access his Sethra ability. Simon reaches toward the ground and pulls a black dagger out of the darkness spread across the dirt. He wields the weapon and uses it in both hands to etch a traversal ring into the rough terrain. The ring was crude and sloppy due to Simon's hasty panic. The traversal wouldn't be perfect. He might get banged up. But it was better than staying here and dying. Naton was pushed down to his knees, face to the ground, as Ziva stomped on his back. Yekuthiel stood over his oldest friend. He'd only left camp for a brief moment. The betrayal in his heart left him with so many mixed emotions as he stared down at Naton in a cold, violent shock. Why was the only word that made it past his lips. You were going to kill him. We already learned what we needed. Your experiment was finally a success. There was no point in any more senseless killing. Naton spoke to the red sand, unable to look up, as Ziva applied pressure to his back with her heel. Naton, our plans are so much higher than one luxurious life from Sanctum. How could you not understand that? Rage began to bubble up in the Nova's words. Naton tries to push up to meet his chief's gaze, but gets stomped flat against the sand by Ziva's boot. Stay down, she shouts. Yekuthiel, this isn't how you change the layers. You've lost your way. Why can't you see that, friend? Pain streaked Naton's voice. Yekuthiel raised his hand, gathering fire in his palm as his wings spread and blazed a heat so intense that Ziva staggered back and shielded herself. This is how I changed the layers. You've lost your loyalty, traitor. Naton only had a moment to meet his eyes with Yekuthiel before the Nova's flame washed over him. His screams of pain lasted only a brief few seconds before the air was left with drifting ash and silence. Ziva stood just out of the range of attack, wide-eyed, very glad she was forced back. Yekuthiel stood and gazed at the pile of ash that he used to call his only companion among these animals. Naton's lime-green soul link hung into the air above the ash, decorated with open hands around the lock. Ziva stayed quiet, feeling a cold sweat as she watched her chief think to himself for 10 minutes in silence. Naton's link shaking, breaking apart, and leaking through the sand as it fell. No one in the camp dared make a noise or movement. Finally, the winged Nova raised his head, looking at Ziva, and spoke with a calm tone. Simon has probably already traversed up to layer 3. I'm the only one among us from Voltara that can traverse so many layers away currently. But Chief, with your new research, you could go down and retrieve Gabriel now. He's been reborn. You can unlock his soul link. Maybe Naton learned his lesson. You could find him too if you unlocked your link. Yekuthiel walked over next to Ziva. And I will, but first I need to catch Simon. I can't let him run off to King Erez while I gather you all up. It won't take me long. Ziva takes a chance and puts her hands out, pleading with her chief. Who cares if they have that slippery shadow, man? We could meet them with our whole tribe with your research. Yekuthiel looked into her crazed, blood-hungry eyes. He did like what she was saying this time. The thought of destroying King Erez with all of them was like a dream. He put a hand on her shoulder. I agree with you, Ziva. Gather up the other infernos. We'll discuss the plan. Ziva smiled and gave a large sigh of relief. Yes, Chief. All of the rock tribe's infernos were gathered in the center of the camp, now gazing up at Yekuthiel, who floated over them, resembling Razor-In as he flapped his large eagle-like wings of fire. Yekuthiel called out to the small group. You are my fittest, finest soul kindlers. Your next journey will be the most important of your lives. Ziva and the others cheer loudly, raising their weapons as Yekuthiel continues. Who here is prepared to take a great leap? A plunge into the layers below even Voltara? The loud cheers grew a bit mixed. Ziva watched her chief raise his arms. She stared at his palms and knew the fear she was feeling would soon be justified. Yekuthiel's fire swelled between his hands, aimed at his tribe. I will come for you when we will own every layer that opposes the rock tribe. Ziva gulps down her fear and steps forward, raising her weapon. Stand proud, brothers and sisters. We will be reborn in our prophet's fire. She would put all her trust in her chief. The small group of infernos raised their weapons and gave a war cry as Yekuthiel's fire slammed into Ziva's body and spread around her as quickly as light spread through darkness. Each member was covered in the prophet of Razor-In's righteous light until they were all reborn. Yekuthiel landed in the center of the ash-soaked camp, where weapons lay melted against the ground. He looked around at the many soul links shaking and melting through the molten sand around him. Yekuthiel takes a deep breath, everything silent except the crackling of his fire slowly burning away in the sand. He spoke to himself through his thoughts. This is what I've been working toward. Yakuthiel holds his hands in front of himself, gathering up his Sethra and condensing it between his palms. He had seen his own soul link enough times in his research to understand what he was crafting. He had put more care into this design than any other. Between his hands, a key formed in the shape of his soul's lock. The shape of the bittings reminded him of a wildfire sticking out in a random jagged pattern. Yakuthiel fully shapes his soul key before gripping at the reddish-orange key, testing the density of his creation. His smile couldn't be helped. He had planned this creation for so long, and it felt like perfection in his hands. He presses the blade of the key to the lock embedded in him, his soul link shimmering around his chest. Still one with his body, Yakuthiel plunges the key into his soul link with a loud cry of pain. Sparks of Sethra come from his link as he twists the key. A loud click blasts through the empty, burned-up camp as Yakuthiel gives a shout of pain. The crimson soul link absorbs the key, drifts out of the Nova's body, and shatters into a glittery red mist. Yakuthiel stood shaking and breathing heavily. He was finally free. Chapter 14. Zev woke with a startle as he heard shuffling and shouting outside in the courtyard, stomping in the halls of the manor, shaking him and Mira awake. Mira stands up with a jolt of panic, quickly getting dressed in her training tunic and strapping on her oversized satchel. Zev was bouncing around the room, fitting into his own training tunic in confusion, following her as they ran after the other trainees. Out in the courtyard, Levon was standing next to the man who had come 2 weeks prior, Sar. They stood in the center of a traversal ring. Sar looked disheveled as he leaned down to touch the ring and push his Sethra through it. Mira pushes past the bigger trainee in her way as she and Zev run right to the edge of the glowing ring. Zev stops in place, seeing the look of nerves on his teacher's face. Mira calls out quickly. "Sir, what's going on?" Levon looks up to meet their eyes. "I have to go alone. It's too dangerous." "I'm sorry, you two. I promise when I get back we'll discuss plans to traverse at a later date." Just as his words finished, the cylinder of light shot up around the two men with a burst of sound that made Mira wince back from how close she was. Zev took a few steps forward before stopping just before the traversal ring. He stared down at it, all of his thoughts swelling and roaring in his ears like he was trapped in a hurricane. How could he wait even longer? What if Simon was hurt or worse? Zev took a step into the ring, examining the damage it had received from the usage. As his foot passed the edge of the ring, it felt like he had walked right into the eye of that hurricane. His thoughts calmed, even though the world around him still felt like a raging storm. Zev turns back, looking at Mira. A few tears well up in his eyes. "I have to go, Mira. I have to help him this time. I know he's down there." Zev dropped to his knees in the traversal ring and planted his hands against it, Sethra filling his arms and surging down into it. Mira didn't have long to think. Her legs moved faster than her mind. Mira leaped next to Zev in the ring as white light gathered around the rim. "You'll die if you do this alone, you idiot." Zev grit his teeth as his peak flame. Sethra worked its way through the circle, Mira's Inferno Sethra quickly following alongside to smooth blow. Traversing an extra layer from their soul links was exponentially harder for them. Levon had told them to not even try it until they were both Infernos. "I know, but I can't just wait for Simon to die again." Mira could hear the desperation and pain in his voice, but then she could see the physical damage he was taking from attempting this already. Purple energy bursts from around his forearms and up his neck, leaving behind deep Sethra burns. Zev lets out cries of agony as the white traversal light grows around them both. Mira turns her face down and focuses all of her attention on keeping the traversal as stable as possible. She knew if this went even slightly wrong, Zev could die. This was even harder on the energy in her Inferno body due to the slight damage to the ring. She let out a low-pitched yell as pain shot up her arms. The other trainees stood frozen and watched as another pillar of light flashed into existence, leaving Zev and Mira nowhere to be seen when it faded. Simon was swinging through trees with his shadow serpent's blade in the lush jungles of Layer 3. It had taken him almost 2 weeks to rest and regain his strength, as well as get the hang of his newly reborn body. Now he was flying through the tall trees, dodging vines and lesser beasts, as 2 Inferno-level soul kindlers from the rock tribe chased him from the ground. They weren't near the peak of Inferno like Simon was, yet they still traversed all the way up to Layer 3 in only 2 weeks. Simon's stomach turned as he realized what that crazed Nova had done to his own people. But after what he had put Simon through, in those 6 months, He believed it. One of the kindlers, a shorter, more broad woman with dark brown, shaggy hair, shouted up at him while hurling a stray ability made up of rock Sethra. "Get down here and fight us, you snake." The rock blast smashed the bark off of a nearby tree as Simon swiveled in the air, latching on to a new branch in the distance and swinging again. If he could make it to the town he spotted a few nights ago, maybe he could find a way to contact King Erez, or maybe he could get innocent people involved and hurt. The grip on his sword's hilt tightens as frustration and panic build in him. At the peak of his swing, his blade makes a clicking noise, creaks, and then snaps like a wire under too much pressure. The kindlers behind him snarled with meant like hungry dogs, but Simon wouldn't let himself be meat for them again. As he plummets to the dirt, he raises up a shadow bar of Sethra from the shade all over the ground, grabbing it as he falls and whirling a bit to catch his weight on it. Slowing his fall until he's face to face with the rock soul kindlers. Simon had read that being reborn had many side effects on you, but he still couldn't fathom the true name of his weapon ability changing. It could still create it, but it was weak and unreliable in a real fight like this. On the other hand, or claw perhaps, his other brand new ability was unnamed, but it was violently powerful already. Being reborn truly was complicated. A sharp rock whizzes past his cheek, slicing the skin and leaving a small blood trickle on Simon's face. "Pay attention, snake," the broad woman called out with a sadistic grin. Simon couldn't hold back with a 2-on-1 fight here. If he was stronger, he had to prove it. The kindlers of the rock tribe were ruthless, and they loved combat. He didn't want to kill, but he wanted to survive above all else. Simon crouched down for a moment, his powerful new draconic legs gearing up for his assault as Shadow Sethra gathered around his whole right arm. The broad woman was wearing metal rings around her fingers that binded over her fists, studs protruding from each knuckle of the fist weapon. The other kindler, a lanky man with wispy silver hair, carried a short sword and a round shield. The stout woman stomps the ground, sending up a large head-sized rock with her Sethra before punching it, launching it directly at Simon. In a feral fury, Simon leaps forward at a speed that exceeds that of either lesser infernos. The arm gathering Sethra behind him seemed to grow into a dragon's claw the size of his own body. Using his wings, he corrects his trajectory, leaning to one side and letting the broad woman's attack barely scrape his left arm, keeping his attack focused directly on the weaker link next to her. As Simon flies at the lanky man, the man holds his shield up, whipping out his wind Sethra in front of him, trying to disturb Simon's flight. Simon glides along the man's wind at a speed that leaves him staggering back with his shield up. The Dragon Claw ability swings forward like the scythe of a reaper, cleaving through the wind kindler the same way an arrow tears through air. Blood sprays from the kindler's neck as he grasps at his wound and falls to the ground. The stout woman next to him shouts, "Finally ready for a fight, snake," with a violent thrill in her eyes, paying no mind to her comrade. In closer range now, Simon and the woman trade blow for blow. Her power up close was nothing to laugh at. Even if he was technically the more skilled kindler, her rock type was much better at this type of combat. She was already battering him with punches and rock strikes, and his mind kept drifting to his shadow serpent's blade. The whole reason he had designed that ability was to be able to fight at a distance while maintaining his power. Now it was useless. He could use the strange Dragon Claw ability again, but it wouldn't be fully effective unless he had range to build momentum. "What's the matter, snake? All out of venom?" A heavy punch hit his forearm as it blocked his face, but it still sent him back a few feet in a slight daze. "If you're not going to fight back, then stay down." She lunged forward into a diving punch. Simon flies back, making it 6 feet before she stomps the ground and sends up a small rock wall behind him. His back crashes against it, and he lays panting with blood running from his nose and oozing down his face. The brute puts her fists together, cracking her knuckles against each other with a scoff of annoyance. The little snake grows wings and claws. Now all of a sudden it thinks it's a dragon? What a joke. Simon breathes heavily, slowly standing off of the rock wall and holding a hand out from his right side. She recognized this. It's how he summoned his weak little blade that couldn't even swing on trees without snapping. The woman's scoff turned into a laugh. "Really? You're going to summon that unfinished trash? Go on, I'm dying to see you fail again." Simon thought about her words more than he meant to. For a moment, he did think he was a beast, a monster even, after what he had done. Tales of dragons in children's stories always depicted them as violent killers that hoarded whatever they craved with pure greed. He had killed to survive twice now. He wanted to survive more than anything. He wanted to see his family more than anything, to watch Zev grow. Was that considered greed? Was he a dragon? The words left his lips as soon as the thought played out in his mind. Shadow Dragon's Blade. His ability's new true name rang through the air like a lightning strike, shadows shooting into his palm from every possible source within 30 feet of him. The woman threw an arm up to block her eyes as the force from the shadow Sethra whipped around her with intense pressure. The hilt of the weapon formed in his hand, the pommel resembling the head of a black dragon. The crossguard formed, taking the shape of the dragon's outstretched wings. Finally, the blade started to form down toward the ground, much longer and wider than the serpent's blade had been. This new weapon was a segmented greatsword. The blade finished forming and was stabbed into the ground as Simon gripped it tightly. It was like staring at the jagged tail of a dragon. Each segment resembled scales overlapping, held together tightly by shadow chains thicker than the serpent's blade. Simon could feel the tremendous power flowing through his new technique. This made his wild claw-like ability look like a flame's practice. He takes a step behind his greatsword, gripping the hilt with both hands as the rock kindler watches him, stunned. The pressure of his ability alone let her know she had no chance. She shook her head after a moment. Wait, we could. She was cut off as Simon's weapon blasted through the ground at his feet, curving and shooting up at her from the dirt below. Blood spilled from her mouth as she hung in the air, skewered through the gut on the segmented, scaled blade. I'm sorry, Simon said, retracting his weapon, letting her body fall near her comrade. A cold reality set in for him as he didn't see soul links rise from the bodies. Simon turns and runs toward the nearby town, his new greatsword resting on his back, strapped to him with his shadow Sethra. Chapter 15. The small town on Layer 3 was having a normal quiet day as any other, that is, until a slightly damaged traversal ring etched itself into the ground on the left end of the front gate and exploded in a flash of white light. Zev flies out of the light, back slamming into the bars of the gate before he slumps to the dirt, shivering and grunting. Mira is knocked in the opposite direction, rolling across the ground, tucking a bit as she slows to a stop. Zev leans up on his elbows, coughing heavily. Blood splatters the dirt, trickling from his ears and mouth. His whole body was shaking, he couldn't stand up, and he could already feel the fresh Sethra burns all over his body, going all the way up to his chin in random lines of pain. Mira stands up quickly and rushes over to his side, terrified of what she might find. Her eyes light up as her Sethra scans his body for internal injuries or anything fatal. Zev dropped on one of his shoulders and rolled to his side, looking at her. We made it. He rasped out. You're insane, she shouted at him once she realized he wasn't going to immediately die. He winces at her, shouting, We need to. His vision quickly fades and his head thuds on the dirt. Mira mumbles to herself, upset with how reckless this had been. If she hadn't joined in, he'd be dead for sure. As she starts trying to pick him up, a black-scaled figure leaps out of the jungle around them, skidding to a stop only 10 or so feet from them, a giant menacing sword draped over his back. Mira remembers Lavon's saying it was too dangerous, and she tenses. What could she do in a fight while guarding Zev's body? Simon's eyes look from the gate straight to her, then slowly down to Zev. He grows pale with confused shock. He rushes to his side, yelling out Zev's name in concern. Mira sees his emerald eyes and realizes it had to be Simon. Now that she wasn't staring at his new features, his face was so familiar. Mira started to panic with a mixture of excitement and desperation, trying to explain everything she and Zev had been trying to do to get here. Her words jumbling for what might be the first time in her life as her heart races. Simon shakes his head, trying to listen to her wild shouts and stuttering processing. Simon grabbed her shoulder and squeezed it softly. Breathe. Mira nods quickly and tries to gather all her thoughts, her mind slowly coming back together as she says, He's going to be okay. I have knowledge, Sethra. I scanned his vitals. A man rushes out of his home and stops by the small group. He had dark brown hair down to his shoulders and vibrant brown eyes. The expression on his face was one of concern. Is that boy alive? Come, quickly. My wife can treat him. Simon cautiously looks at the man, but quickly nods and helps Mira carry Zev. The brown-haired man eyes Simon back. Are you Reborn? My goodness, you all must have a very interesting tale. My name is Sel. My name is Simon. He responds quickly as they speed their way into the town and straight inside Sel's home. His wife, a short, plump woman with dirty hair, brown eyes, and a face full of freckles similar to Mira, gasps seeing Zev lay on the table. "Orly, my dear, we need your skills with the plants. This poor young man is hurt badly," Sel said as he arranged Zev properly on the dining table, clearing space. Orly rushes across the room to a large set of chests, opening drawers and gathering many different seeds, rushing them to Zev's side, along with a mortar and pestle. Oh dear, what caused this? A bad traversal from Nocturne. He's only a flame. He shouldn't have tried it. Panic rose back in her voice. He must be quite strong to have not died from something like that as a flame. Orly sounded shocked but confident as she used her natural Sethra to instantly grow different seeds, tossing the plants into her mortar and crunching them up into a dusty substance. Sel nods as he brings her strange vials of colourful liquids and a few cups. Simon and Mira wait patiently, taking this moment to attempt to relax, though it was very hard with everything happening. Orly went to work mixing and concocting some kind of potion. It ended as a lime green liquid with the texture of watery slime. Sel helped her move Zev a bit as they got him to drink down the potion from a cup. It took quite a while, but finally Sel and Simon carried Zev to a bed in the back of the house before regrouping with the others in the living room. Orly is sitting back in a chair, sweating and drinking from a bottle of wine. Mira was across from her at the table with a hand running through her green locks, emotionally recovering. Orly speaks up after another sip now that everyone is together. He should be all right when he wakes up, but he's going to need a lot of rest. Try to get him to lay off of training for a bit, if you can. Simon sits down by Mira and rubs his scaled claws down his face gently. "I'm just so happy that he's alive." Mira leans on her hand, looking up at the draconic man. "I bet he'll say the exact same when he wakes up." Her smile tries to lift her tired eyes. A few hours pass by in the friendly townsfolk's home as they wait for Zev to wake up. This was all too lucky to be anything but fate, at least that's how it felt to Mira and Simon. They decided to take this time to rest up themselves, with Mira taking a nap in a second free room and Simon sleeping on a chair in the room with Zev. Yekuthiel hovered over the familiar small village as he emerged from the jungle he had died in so many years ago. He was free now, and he was strong. He wondered for a moment if his parents still lived here. They had hid his weakness for years from King Erez and his tyranny. His blazing wings flapped over the people that looked like ants. He was starting to draw attention quickly. Guards and townsfolk alike started to leave their homes and stare up at his magnificent form. He slowly glides down until he can make out all the familiar faces of his home. He has played this moment in his head many times already. The only way to make change in this world was to flatten the problem under pure power. He lowers his hands down toward his home, their faces staring at him in awe. He wonders how many of them even recognize him. His words came firm and rang through the streets effortlessly, a heat following them and pressing down on the people. "You shall all meet Razor in, you shall all learn my light." Fire swelled in his palms. The pressure alone caused a few people to start to sweat and break away from the crowd. It was only once the screaming that Ziva entered the town with all the Reborn rock tribe infernos ready to slaughter. Yekuthiel flew through, blasting homes with large waves of flames hot enough to melt through even metal at first contact. Sel felt the house shake violently and rushed outside. He was met with ash, blood, and bodies in the streets. Yekuthiel looks down on Sel with one hand toward him, fire swirling in his palm. Sel went pale, looking up at his son after so many years torn apart. Even with his reborn features, Sel would never have forgotten that face. "Yekuthiel, what have you done? How have you? You will know Razor in, father. Accept my light." His voice stayed cold and determined as he reminded himself of his plans. This was required. Narton's voice nags at the back of his mind, but he stops it with a harsh growl of anger, shouting out a pained war cry. His fire erupts in a stream with the force of a dragon's maw. Sel's sight on this layer would be his son's ultimate, unwavering power. The flames washed over half of the house, blowing straight through it and blowing out every window at once. The force of the blast even ripped through the shop right behind his old home. Once they were all reborn, they would understand why this was better. Mira fell out of bed, hearing the blast and feeling a sweltering heat fill the room as the windows around her blew out. Simon jolts out of the chair, rushing to Zev and shielding him as best he can before leaping through the broken window with his little brother, escaping the building's rising heat. Mira frantically grabbed her huge satchel and slammed it against her own window frame to clear it of any glass before hurtling over it. She finds herself outside in the carnage next to Simon and the unconscious Zev. Orly stumbled into view, standing in the ash of her destroyed home, clutching at a large wooden debris chunk that was stuck deep in her gut. She looked to the sky and began to weep as she recognized her son rampaging through homes from the sky. She dropped to her knees and fell on her side as the home she had raised him in crumbled around her. Simon watched in horror, grabbing Mira by her wrist and tugging her toward the jungle. Zev clutched to his chest. "We have to run now." Mira stares at him in shock. Even as she felt bile rise in her throat from all the carnage, she still managed to ground herself and plant her feet. "Run? We have to help these people." Simon sees Yekuthiel soaring through the town like an eagle of death and destruction. "That's a Nova. We have no chance, Mira." She looked into his eyes and her heart sank for a moment because she knew how correct he was if that was truly the unknown Nova. Before they could share any more words, Simon heard a familiar, excitable voice call out, "There you are, Snake." Ziva stood across from them all, wielding her twin blade in both hands, her eyes locked on Simon like a hunter's eyes on prey. Chapter 16. Zev's eyes shook as he lifted himself from the grass. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of burned bodies. Sparks flew through the air before him. Simon was wielding his shadow dragon's blade, currently battling the excitable warrior. Ziva was twirling her twin blade, wrapped in lightning Sethra, and blocking the links of his weapon as they tried to lash out at her. They seemed to have a good back and forth happening. Zev's head shifted slowly to a loud clang to his left. Near the wreckage of the home he had never known he was in, Mira was dodging the attacks of a large wild man who was swinging a warhammer like a child's toy. Zev fully gets to his feet as emotions grip every inch of his mind, pulling in different directions. Who were these strange people? They had pale grey skin and pointed ears like nothing he had ever seen. He tries to focus on the fighting, but the new sensation of loud screams fills his ears as people in the town are getting torched by some flying winged beast he can't quite make out from this distance. Zev closes his eyes for a second, shaking his head firmly before steadying himself and rushing to Mira's aid. That had to be his priority right now. Mira dives out of the way of the brute's strike as dirt sprays into the air where she just was. She rolls and stops in a crouched pose, aiming her bow at Gavriel in his reborn state. To her, he resembled a monster. Monsters could be killed. She hadn't named this ability yet, but it should work well enough with her training. Mira releases her arrow at the brute. Gavriel watches as 6 arrows sporadically erupt from the normal bow, all flying at slightly different speeds and angles. How was that possible? They looked so realistic. What Sethra could possibly replicate weapons that easily? He grips his hammer and slams the ground in front of him, his force Sethra creating a wave to block the arrows. To Gavriel's shock, the arrows pass through the wave with ease, all converging on him. His ability dissipates as he stumbles back and wildly swings his weapon at the arrows. Terrified, the warhammer slams through the illusory arrows, dissipating just in time for the broad man to get struck right in the chest with Mira's real arrow. Gavriel growls out in pain, letting the arrow stay embedded in his chest as he rushes toward Mira with the anger of an injured bull. Mira quickly stands up. She was hoping that trick would have taken him down for good. The wild warrior was closing the distance quickly when he tripped. Confusion and anger mixed across his face like the hot and cold air of a tornado. Zev stood behind him, gripping his purple strings. His heels dug into the dirt as he wrapped his Sethra around the brute's ankle and used his weight to pull his leg back. His Sethra was still only flame level, but they were much easier to make physical than when he tried to gather the mushroom. "Now, Mira!" Zev shouts through the pain, shooting up his arms. Mira understood immediately, dropping her bow and aiming one hand forward as Gavriel's body hit the ground. "Nightmare Cowl." She almost spits the words as the true name rings loudly at the man. The black wave of Sethra blasted out of her hand, hissing through the air and crashing right onto Gavriel's head. The man squirms, rolling onto his back and grasping at his face as the mask seals off all of his senses, ready to place him in a world of horrors only his own mind could create. Zev's strings dissipated from around his ankle. Zev didn't see a man, he saw a monster ready to kill his best friend. He started running toward the struggling brute, reaching to his back and pulling his dagger from the sheath there. His thoughts intensified in his mind. "You will not take anyone from me. Mira watched as Zev leaped onto Gavriel before the man could fully realize what was happening in the real world, stuck in Mira's nightmare cowl. Zev began stabbing Gavriel in the chest over and over again around the arrow, as if trying to decorate Mira's attack. The brute let out 2 screams of enraged pain before they were drowned in muffled gurgles of blood. Zev stilled. Once the broad man stopped struggling, his body lay limp under Zev as his chest heaved and his bloody hands shook. Mira's ability dissipates off of Gavriel's head, leaving his blank expression staring into the sky. With no soul link any longer, he would not be reborn ever again. Zev's twin blade twirled in front of her, electricity crackling around the blades as she stared at Simon with killer intent. She spoke her ability's true name with the gusto of a crazed zealot. Razorin's light. Simon leaped back, trying to dodge the strike. However, the blinding speed was too much for him. Lightning swirled around the spinning twin blade before she jabbed it forward, with the point aimed right at where Simon was leaping. A bolt of lightning arcs through the air and strikes Simon on one of his legs. The pain scattered through his entire body, and he flies through the air, back slamming against one of the tall jungle trees. Simon crumples on himself, falling to the ground and rolling until he is laid on his back, his legs smoking as he grits his teeth, still clutching his shadow dragon's blade. With how tense his hands are, he doesn't know if he can currently let go of it. Ziva had a wicked grin spread across her cheeks as she began walking toward him. "I've been waiting for this, Snake." It was right then that Gavriel's scream cut through the air, catching her attention. Instantly her head jerked to see Zev deliver the finishing blow on her partner. Simon desperately tried to use this moment of shock to his advantage, but all he could manage was getting to his hands and knees as his muscle spasms slowed. Simon suddenly realized Ziva wasn't walking toward him anymore. She was running right for the younger soul kindlers. He cried out while trying to move his legs faster. "Stop! Fight me, coward!" Ziva ignored Simon, her bloodthirsty eyes only seeing Zev as she ran at him like a wolf ready for its kill. Zev's hand still shook as he looked up to meet the woman's crazed, anger-filled gaze, her blade gleaming brightly as she raised it over her head with a twirl. The world felt like it was progressing in slow motion as Zev desperately tried to think of a way out of her weapon's path. "Stop." Yakuthiel's words washed across all of them as he hovered overhead, casting down his overwhelming presence. Ziva froze, as if Razorin itself had spoken the words, the weight causing her shoulders to sag and her weapon to lower. Simon, Mira, and Zev had all listened just as well, the level of the man above sending their thoughts to the back of their minds like how light erases shadows. Zev felt sweat beading on his forehead as he looked up at the winged Nova. That was no beast as he had thought. That was a man more powerful than Zev could fathom, and Yakuthiel's eyes were locked on Zev. He felt the Nova's gaze looking through him, as if he could see every inch of his soul. Yakuthiel slowly glided down to stand over Zev, still looking into his eyes sternly. "What an interesting young man. You reached the peak of flame, even with such constraints." "Constraints? What do you mean?" Zev managed to jam his question out through his stiff jaw. Yakuthiel's words danced across Zev just as his string Sethra did the day he learned of them, mocking him, making him feel smaller than the bugs in the dirt. "You're a burnt soul." Chapter 17. Lavon stood on the other end of the village, examining the carnage calmly. He could feel the presence of the other Nova's Sethra from this far. It wasn't until he quietly made his way around the edge of the village that he saw Yakuthiel standing over Zev, an angry woman wielding a twin blade, Mira watching in horror, and a strange scaled man that resembled a dragon just getting to his feet, panic swelling in his eyes. The words reached Lavon just as he arrived. Burnt soul. Lavon stepped up from behind the battle scene, clapping his hands with played-up excitement. "Does somebody else see the value in my promising student? You must be quite the knowledgeable kindler, my friend." Yakuthiel slowly turns to look at Lavon. The two Novas take a few more steps toward each other before stopping. His wings flare out as he speaks. "You must be Lavon?" Lavon raises his eyebrows in mock surprise, starting to raise a hand. "Aren't you a bright one?" For the others, the movements happened in an instant. A flaming blur crashed into an exploding geyser of water, creating hot steam around the entire area as the two Novas shot into the sky. Zev tried to keep track of who was doing what, but instead just saw a light show among the steam in mid-air. Occasionally seeing Yakuthiel catch his balance with his wings, and Lavon seemingly hopping around on thin air with the whimsy of a child playing on an invisible jungle gym. Zev shifts his gaze to Ziva, realizing she was staring daggers through him. Her words cut through the loud blasts in the air. A burnt soul that hasn't been reborn is useless. But if Razorin's word is to keep you alive, then you will stay put until my chief finishes this fake. Zev stood up off Gavriel's corpse and spoke loudly over the Nova's clashes, clutching his dagger. I'll stay put as long as you don't hurt anyone else here. Ziva's expression morphs into an irritated, toothy smirk. We don't need any of these weaklings. She raises her weapon at Mira, who is still trying to grasp everything that is happening. Zev quickly raises his dagger, shoving it against the side of his neck hard enough to get a trickle of blood running down. He speaks with firm conviction. Whoever Razorin is going to be really upset if you do that. The woman's eyes widen, and she lowers her weapon quickly. Her tone was dripping with frustration. Stop these games, burnt soul. You'll lose no matter what you try. Electricity ran through her twin blade. Before the altercation between them could take another step further, Simon sent shadow spikes out of the ground and right up at Ziva. She notices at the last second and leaps away from the dense spikes as they dissipate as quickly as they launched out. Simon stood, mostly recovered from her ability. He was partially hidden in the steam, one hand toward her and the other gripped on his greatsword. If he wanted her attention, he got it. Her shriek of anger almost matched the raging battle overhead as she ran at Simon. Enough of you snakes! Zev drops his dagger, cursing. He had hoped Simon's attack would get her while he distracted her. Her instincts were too sharp. He rushes to Mira's side, helping her to her feet and making sure she is all right before watching Simon clash with the furious warrior again. Zev could see how hurt his older brother already was from fighting her before. They may be a close match, but he had the feeling Ziva had the upper hand here. Mira quickly snaps out of her shock and says, I think I have enough Sethra for one more nightmare cowl. Zev's mind was racing for a moment. He slowly held both his hands up, spreading his fingers, Sethra gathering quickly into them. He speaks slowly, watching spark fly from Simon's battle. Hang on to it, Mira. I have to do this. What? Even if you find the true name, the level between a new Inferno and her is insane. She leans close to his ear as if she didn't want to be overheard, even in this wild mixture of sounds. Zev thought through his memories of Simon, his memories of his mother, and even of Mira, scrounging for the depth he was lacking. Why couldn't he find it? He couldn't fail here. Simon would die again. Ziva backs Simon toward the jungle with her electric slashes rapidly. He tries to keep up, but he has already expended so much Sethra. Ziva leaps into the air, readying a powerful strike, wanting to end Simon here and now with a savage war cry. The world for Zev froze, and the way Ziva hung in the air was so familiar. A vision of his mother, Ruth, filled his mind. When he was much younger, he and Simon would watch her puppet, her marionette, made of her water Sethra. The way it danced in the air always entertained the boys, even inspiring them to start their shadow puppet shows. Familiar words buzzed in his mind. It almost felt like his own Sethra was burning in them. You will not take anyone from me. Zev spoke the true name of his ability, the Sethra behind his words ringing out under the Nova's battle loud enough to catch everyone's attention. Marionettes dance. Purple strings of pure Sethra shot from Zev's fingers directly at Ziva's back faster than she could intercept while focused on her downward strike. The wires of energy slammed into Ziva's spine, freezing her in mid-air above Simon. Her eyes widened and her teeth gritted as purple energy started to rise up around her face until she was wearing an expressionless purple mask, like a puppet. Zev's eyes were glowing with his Sethra as he lowered the warrior to the ground in front of Simon with the wires. Mira staggers away from Zev as he unleashes pressure that she can't wrap her mind around. Had his ascension to Inferno been more successful than hers? She looks at the wires holding Ziva in place like a puppet at the ready, and she follows the strings down to his hands. On his skin below his knuckles were two purple masks branded on him. On his left hand, a frowning mask, while on his right, a smiling mask. Simon was holding his greatsword in both hands, trying to block the oncoming blow. When it didn't come, he lowered his weapon with wide eyes. Ziva's purple mask was staring past him. She lowered herself to the ground, standing stiffly like a soldier. The pressure from Zev's ascended Sethra washes over Simon, making him jerk his attention past Ziva to watch his younger brother. The bursts of explosive energy in the air slowed to a quick stop, silence falling over the burning village as if it had been plunged under the vast oceans of Loch. Yekuthiel and Levon stood in mid-air, floating above the display of new power. Yekuthiel looked shocked, while Levon had a wild, entertained smile trying to leap from his cheeks. Yekuthiel had seen a bit of himself in the burnt soul. What was this, a trick? He shouts to Levon, who had claimed to be this kindler's teacher. How? What have you done? Levon looks at the winged nova with a smug expression. What have I done? Nothing much, just a working theory of mine. You look like a man of science yourself, I'm sure you understand. Anger swells in Yekathiel's gut. He had thought Zev might be someone like him, but instead he was just another cosmic joke aimed at him. His throat was tight as the words hissed out. No, I will not stand for this mockery. You people are evil. I will purge your influence from this world. Everything happened in almost the same instant. As heat gathered in the sky rapidly, Levon leaped off, seemingly thin air, down toward the village. He landed a bit away, on a roof that hadn't completely collapsed. He knew Yekuthiel wasn't watching him any longer. Mira shot up to her feet and tried to start running away from Zev, realizing the winged nova was staring right at him. If she was too close, she would needlessly die. She didn't make it far before Simon flew full speed at her, scooping her up into his arms and flying up into the sky, trying to get a good, safe distance without being too far. Zev felt Sethra surging through his body and down his strings. Not only was his Sethra mixing with Ziva, but it felt like he was fueling her lightning Sethra, growing it with his somehow. Adrenaline had filled him, and the true scope of his power had not set in. He moved on instinct, or rather, he made Ziva move. It felt like she was an extension of his body. Ziva leaped back, landing in front of Zev protectively, clutching her twin blade, the purple energy fueling and converting into her lightning. Sethra quickly as it filled her weapon. Zev felt thoughts and memories that were not his. They were filling his head in a cluster. Yekuthiel cried out, enraged, flying down at Zev like a bullet. But to Zev, it seemed like he was moving slower than before. Was the nova tired? Ziva leaped off the ground right up toward her chief, her weapon growing twice its length in lightning Sethra as she swiped at him. Yekuthiel catches her blow with one of his dense wings of flame. The power of the attack is much stronger than he imagined, stopping his momentum and clashing with a bright flash. Zev grits his teeth, pushing more Sethra into Ziva. How did he stop that charge? He couldn't overthink this. He had to use every ounce of strength he had. Ziva's weapon started slowly digging into the fiery wing. Yekuthiel shouts down at Zev furiously, More tricks? I'll kill you and all your weak little. Bang! Levon spoke calmly, shooting his ability from his aimed finger gun. The jet of high-pressure water blasts right through Yekuthiel's free wing, leaving a giant hole in it. Yekuthiel grunts as he jerks to one side. Ziva's overfueled attack cleaves through his other wing. Yekuthiel crashes down into the ground, heavily knocking up dirt and rock. Ziva landed between the clipped Nova and Zev, taking a protective fighting stance. Mira guided Simon's trajectory along the side of the battle as the tables seemed to turn. They hovered just to the side of Yekuthiel as he was trying to stand up, covered in scrapes and bruises. Mira held out her hand as Simon kept her steady in the air. Her words barely catch the Nova's attention, even as they ring. Nightmare cowl. The black viscous Sethra hit the side of Yekuthiel's shoulder, traveling up and trying to wrap around his face. With fire in his hand, he scratched at his face, ripping away at the ability and blurring his senses for a moment, his shouts turning more feral in his rage. More tricks? I'll turn you all to ash! Simon landed, setting Mira down, gripping his blade from his back, and sending the whip-like blades spinning around the weaker Nova's legs, constricting them together, piercing them, and drawing blood. Yekuthiel attempts to break free, stumbling forward with his legs tied up. As he falls forward towards Ziva, he is met with her twin blade sliding up through his gut and sticking out of his back, lightning crackling around it. Yekuthiel found it impossible to speak as his body spasmed, face to face with Ziva, wearing Zev's purple, expressionless mask. Ziva steps back, swiping out her twin blade, leaving a spray of blood across the scorched, torn-up ground. Simon's weapon loosened before retracting into its draconic form. Yekuthiel dropped to his knees, falling forward in a growing pool of his own blood. He felt his Sethra shaking and fizzling from the half-wings at his back. Only a second later, Zev fell to his knees, clutching at his wrists with pained groans. His strings had snapped as the attack finished. Ziva stood in shock, her mask clearing from her face as she stood over her chief. Yekuthiel forced himself to look up at her with what little strength he had, grunting out through a mouthful of blood. Kill them all. You can still. Yekuthiel knew this would be the end of his story. He would never be reborn now that his soul link was unlocked. But in these last moments, he could at least give himself false hope. Ziva watched as her prophet's face was planted in the dirt. What remained of his wings faded into the air with a faint sizzle. She stepped forward, kneeling and placing a hand on his head. She was the strongest of the rock tribe once again. Levon landed next to her with his light feet, and she looked up at the Nova slowly, speaking carefully. Please let me and my people retreat. We have no chance against you. Simon and Mira surrounded Zev, examining him as he seemed ready to pass out, intense burns running down from each of his fingers to join the rest of the ones he'd obtained from his training. Levon looks down on Ziva with a deep sigh. I'm afraid that decision isn't up to me. Ziva suddenly heard the screams of her tribe coming from deep in the village. She could see different types of Sethra blasting out into the air, but she didn't recognize them. Chapter 18. The moon hung over the town of Crater with a beautiful glow. The endless night of Nocturne was a calming sight after everything they had all been through. Mira, Zev, and Simon were all standing in the courtyard of Levon's estate. It had been a week since the incident. Levon had told them all to stay put and rest while he dealt with the political aftermath. He used air quotes while describing it. Simon stood with his back leaned against the wall and his draconic arms crossed, thinking through his words carefully as they all relaxed. It's still too hard to believe. Zev looks at his older brother, startled, and then his face pales a bit. How do you think I feel? I've always been the weakest around, working hard just to catch up. Now, suddenly He trails off, not knowing if he's ready to address it out loud. Mira looked between them, confused at the back and forth, and she finished Zev's statement. A Nova, and just like every other ascension to Nova, we don't really know how. Zev tenses. Well, Levon seems to know something at least, and he still wants to train us both. He looks over at Simon and corrects himself. All three of us even. Mira pushes her glasses up and speaks in her matter-of-fact tone. Well, of course he does. I trained you up to flame, now you're a Nova. So clearly I'm on the way. And Simon? Come on. Simon is bursting at the seams with Sethra. Zev looked at his best friend, slightly confused. Is that A? A smile cracks his expression. Joke? They all began to laugh light-heartedly. It had taken quite a few days, but they could finally feel the safety in Crater. Pretty soon, Levon would be back, and they could talk about what the future would hold for all of them. It wasn't long after that they all went to their rooms to sleep. Levon had given them each a full one to themselves. Zev laid in his soft bed while running through his memories. Apparently, having a burnt soul was a rare condition that stunted Sethra growth. Previously thought to only be cured by being reborn, it was mainly only known by higher-level soul kindlers on Layer 3. It was hard to see actual signs of it. Levon told him of his theory that burnt souls weren't stunted in growth but simply had an extra barrier around their Sethra as it grew. Like filling a bowl with water but only having a needle-point-sized hole for the water to escape. To get the Sethra out to match others, you had to try much harder. Zev looked at the ascension marks on his hands, and the masks stared back at him. He had proven Levon's theory correct. He had pushed hard enough past the barrier to break it with his ascension to Inferno. He still wasn't sure how he leaped to Nova in the same instance, but that's the only reason everyone survived. He was sure Levon would. But Simon and Mira? Whatever the reason, he was glad. He had killed 2 other kindlers, but still had no firm idea why they were attacking. He couldn't help but wonder why the winged Nova was so vicious. Simon had told him a little about the man, his experimenting, and the matter of Simon's unlocked soul link. It was a frightening notion, knowing that Simon would be gone forever if he died again. But he couldn't help but be curious about the ability to travel to any layer. He wouldn't be surprised if Mira tried to grill Simon for research on how to do it to herself. A soft smile rests on Zev as he leans his head back. They are all safe. He closes his eyes. He could rest easily now. Levon returned after everyone woke up from good sleep. The excited teacher gathered his 3 promising pupils in the courtyard, a fresh, pristine traversal ring behind him already. Good news, everybody. I've done a lot of talking with the other Novas. He motions to Zev. -1. And it looks like we've all agreed that for the moment you all are allowed to live under my watch and train for the protection of the 3 layers. Zev lit up, stepping forward. Does that mean we can all take a trip back to Sanctum finally? Levon clapped his hands with his usual cheery smile. It does. You will need to stay under my surveillance on King Orez's orders, but you'll find I'm quite lenient when it comes to personal matters. Zev looked back at Simon and Mira with excitement swelling in his eyes. His close friend and older brother returned his expression with explosive energy. rushing together and discussing how they're going to spend their time. Levon watches, his face softening more with a kind smile. He spoke after a minute, taking a few steps backwards into the traversal ring. "Are you all coming?" In a flash of light, Levon and his pupils appeared in King Oren's garden, right next to his tree, breaking off some of its bark. Levon looks over at the damage, then over to Oren, who was standing 10 feet away with a stunned expression. Levon clears his throat. "Ooh, so close. I'm sure I'll get it next time." King Oren's eyes and shoulders dropped. He couldn't stop Levon from constantly testing the limits of their world. "Hello, Levon. Please don't make that a habit." Levon walks over, patting Oren on the shoulder. "I will do my best, old friend." Oren's voice dripped with exhaustion. "I'm not your friend." After a quick greeting, the small crew left the castle and made their way into Zev's hometown. Zev and Simon waved goodbye to Mira as her and Levon went to take a carriage to her town, splitting up. Mira made it home the next day, showing off her Nova teacher to her parents and explaining everything that had happened and she had seen. Levon felt the need to comfort them and tell them that he intended to keep all his students safe until they were ready to keep the rest of the layers secure. They were on board fairly quickly, especially her father, who listened to her stories with as much excitement as she had told them. Zev opens the front door of his home, walking in and calling out, "Mom, are you home?" Ruth stumbles into the living room from the kitchen as if she had sprinted at the sound. She stares up at her boys. Simon lifted a draconic clawed hand and waved with a bashful smile. She rushed forward and hugged both of them close, tears forming in her eyes. "I can't believe you're here. You're okay." Simon squeezes into them both, smiling with a similar disbelief. He spoke with pride. "Zev and Mira saved me. I've always known he was strong, but to think he would go so far for me." Ruth looks down at Zev and cups his face, squeezing his cheeks with a teary smile. "You're so stubborn." She pauses and pulls him near, hugging him closely and whispering, "Thank you. I'm so sorry." Zev could hear the tinge of guilt in her voice. He simply pulled away, grabbing her shoulders with a confident smile. "You don't have to worry about anything, Mom. As long as me, Simon, and Mira are around, no one's going to hurt our home." The reunited family took the day to talk about everything that had happened in great detail. They cooked together, eat a hot meal, and enjoy the company they have missed for so long now. Many tears and laughs were shared throughout the day, and Zev finally felt true relief. While everyone else was asleep, Zev got up and walked into the forest he always trained in with Simon. He didn't stop until he found the trees that had almost toppled on top of him while he had been frozen in fear, which felt like forever ago. His eyes scanned the clearing. It wasn't perfect, but the grass had grown almost fully back. It was mended better than he imagined. Zev walked into the middle of the clearing, taking a deep breath of the forest air. Being here now, he knew for sure that he wouldn't freeze again. No matter what surprises came next, he would be ready.